The wind didn't howl across the Kansas plains that February. It screamed. It tore through frozen grasslands like something alive and furious, ripping apart anything foolish enough to stand in its path. Snow didn't fall so much as attack, driving horizontal sheets of ice that blinded travelers and buried entire homesteads overnight. The frontier had seen brutal winters before, but the blizzard of 1873 was different. It killed without mercy, without warning, and without apology. Somewhere along an abandoned supply trail 6 miles outside Abilene, where the road disappeared beneath 3 feet of white nothing, a small figure stood perfectly still. Elias Reed was 6 years old, weighed maybe 40 pounds soaking wet, and should have been dead 2 days ago. Instead, he stood guard. His clothes were frozen stiff against his skin. His fingers had gone numb hours earlier. He couldn't feel them anymore, which was probably better. His face was raw and cracked from windburn. His lips were split and bleeding. Ice crystals had formed in his hair and eyebrows, turning the dark-haired boy ghostly white. In his hands, he gripped a crooked stick about 3 feet long, one end sharpened into a rough point using a rock he'd found near the overturned wagon. Behind him, buried under a pile of snow-covered blankets and canvas tarps, sat a wooden supply crate. Inside that crate, wrapped in every scrap of cloth Elias could salvage, his baby sister Rose lay crying weakly against the storm. The crying was good. When she stopped crying, that meant something bad. Elias had learned that 3 days ago, when Mama stopped breathing. He blinked hard against the memory, forcing it down into the dark place where he'd been shoving everything that hurt too much to think about. There wasn't time for remembering. There wasn't time for crying or being scared or wishing things were different. There was only time for keeping Rose alive. A wolf howled somewhere in the white distance. Elias adjusted his grip on the stick and widened his stance, planting his feet deeper into the snow. His legs shook, not from fear, but from exhaustion and starvation. He hadn't eaten anything except a handful of frozen berries in 2 days. His stomach had stopped hurting yesterday. Now it just felt empty and cold, like the rest of him. But he didn't move, because moving meant leaving Rose unprotected, and leaving Rose unprotected meant breaking the promise. The promise was everything. 3 days earlier, the world had still made sense. The Reed family had been traveling from Independence, Missouri, heading toward a new homestead near Dodge City that Papa had bought with money saved from 5 years of grueling work. The wagon was packed with supplies, tools, seed stock, and dreams of a better life where the land was cheap and opportunity supposedly endless. Elias remembered sitting in the back of the wagon beside Rose's cradle, watching the endless plains roll past beneath a clear winter sky. Mama had been singing, Papa had been whistling. Rose had been sleeping peacefully, her tiny fists curled against her chest. Everything had been fine. Then the storm hit. It came fast, faster than anyone expected. One moment the sky was pale blue and calm. The next, a wall of churning gray-black clouds rose up from the northern horizon like an approaching army. Papa cursed and snapped the reins hard, trying to outrun it to the trading post they'd passed an hour earlier. They never made it. The storm swallowed them whole within minutes. Visibility dropped to nothing. The temperature plummeted 20 degrees in less than an hour. Snow came down so thick and fast that Papa couldn't see the horses anymore, couldn't see the road, couldn't see anything except white chaos. That's when the wagon hit the ditch. Elias didn't remember much about the crash itself, just the sickening lurch, the splintering wood, Mama's scream, Rose's sudden wail, and then cold. So much cold. When he crawled out from under the overturned supplies, his head bleeding from a gash above his left eye, Papa was already working frantically to free the horses. Mama was clutching Rose, who'd been thrown from her cradle but somehow survived unhurt. The wagon was destroyed, one axle shattered completely, one wheel torn clean off, supplies scattered across the frozen ground. Papa tried everything. He tried to repair the axle with rope and spare timber. He tried to calm the horses enough to pull them free. He tried to signal for help by firing his rifle into the storm. Nothing worked. By nightfall, they were trapped. By midnight, Papa was coughing blood. Elias watched his father weaken hour by hour, watched him struggle to breathe, watched the cold settle into his lungs like something alive and patient. Mama tried every remedy she knew, hot compresses, whiskey, prayers whispered desperately into the screaming wind. Papa died just before dawn, his last words barely audible over the storm. Take care of them. Mama held together for almost 6 more hours. She managed to salvage a wooden crate from the wreckage, line it with blankets, and tuck Rose inside where the baby would be protected from the wind. She managed to gather what little food remained: a tin of beans, half a loaf of frozen bread, a canteen of water already turning to slush. She managed to wrap Elias in Papa's coat and make him promise to stay strong. Then she sat down in the snow beside Papa's body, held Elias close, and whispered the words that would define the rest of his life. Protect your sister. Her voice was barely a rasp. Her skin was gray. Her eyes kept drifting closed and snapping open again, fighting something she couldn't win against. Promise me, Elias. I promise, Mama. No matter what happens, no matter how scared you get, you keep her alive. I will. Say it again. I'll keep her alive. His voice cracked. He was 6 years old and didn't understand why Mama was talking like this, why she sounded so far away even though she was right beside him. Mama pulled him closer, pressed her cold lips against his forehead, and whispered one final time, You're stronger than you know, baby, stronger than all of us. Then she closed her eyes and didn't open them again. Elias sat there for a long time, holding her hand, waiting for her to wake up. Rose cried from inside the crate. The storm howled, snow piled higher around them. Eventually, he understood. He was alone now, completely alone except for Rose. And Rose needed him. So the 6-year-old boy stood up, wiped his face with numb fingers, and got to work. Hooks. Surviving the next 3 days required a kind of stubborn determination that most adults didn't possess. Elias couldn't build a fire. Everything was too wet, too frozen, and he didn't know how anyway. He couldn't hunt for food. He had no weapon except a kitchen knife buried somewhere in the scattered supplies. He couldn't call for help. His voice disappeared into the storm without traveling more than a few feet. What he could do was refuse to quit. He dragged the crate with Rose inside to a spot near the overturned wagon where the wreckage provided some shelter from the wind. He piled every blanket, tarp, and piece of canvas he could find over and around the crate, building a crude nest that trapped what little warmth Rose's body generated. He fed her the last of Mama's milk from a bottle he found unbroken in the snow. When that ran out, he melted snow in his mouth and dribbled tiny amounts of water between her lips, terrified she'd choke, but more terrified she'd die of thirst. He stayed awake for 2 days straight, afraid that if he slept something terrible would happen. Wolves would come, the storm would bury them completely, Rose would stop breathing, and he wouldn't notice in time. On the 3rd day, exhaustion finally won. He collapsed beside the crate and slept for maybe 2 hours, dreaming of Mama's voice singing lullabies that got quieter and quieter until they disappeared entirely. He woke to the sound of Rose screaming. For a horrible moment, he thought something was attacking her. He scrambled upright, grabbing the crooked stick he'd fashioned from a broken wagon plank, ready to fight whatever threatened his sister. But there was nothing. Just Rose, hungry and cold and miserable, wailing into the frozen air. The sound broke something inside him and put it back together harder. She was alive, still alive, because he'd kept his promise. He checked her carefully, the way Mama used to, feeling her forehead for fever, checking that her breathing was steady, making sure her fingers and toes weren't turning blue. She seemed okay. Scared and uncomfortable, but okay. I know, he whispered, his voice hoarse and cracked. I know you're cold. I know you're hungry. But you gotta stay quiet, Rosie. Please stay quiet. He didn't know why she needed to stay quiet. Some instinct told him that noise was dangerous out here, that drawing attention was a mistake. As if summoned by his fear, a wolf howled in the distance. Then another answered it, closer this time. Elias felt his heart slam against his ribs. He'd heard wolves before, everyone on the frontier had. But hearing them from inside a warm cabin with Papa's rifle above the door was completely different from hearing them alone in the open with nothing but a stick. He positioned himself between the crate and the direction the howls had come from, gripping the stick with both hands, despite the fact his fingers were so numb he could barely feel the wood. You come near her, he said out loud to the storm, to the wolves, to death itself, and I'll fight you. His voice didn't sound like a child's voice anymore. It sounded hollow and hard and absolutely certain. The wolves never came close enough to test him. Maybe they smelled the death near the wagon and decided it wasn't worth the effort. Maybe they found easier prey elsewhere. Or maybe something in the way that small figure stood motionless in the snow, refusing to run or hide, convinced them to move on. Either way, Elias stood guard until dawn, until his legs gave out and he collapsed into the snow, until Rose's renewed crying dragged him back to consciousness, until standing up and keeping watch became the only thing he knew how to do anymore. Tja, on the morning of the fourth day, the storm finally began to ease. The wind dropped from a scream to a moan. The snow lightened from blinding white to gray curtains that allowed brief glimpses of the landscape beyond. The temperature remained brutal, but without the wind chill, it became something a person might survive instead of something guaranteed to kill them. Elias stood beside the crate, swaying slightly on his feet, staring out at nothing with eyes that had stopped registering details hours ago. He was dying. Some distant part of his brain understood this with calm clarity. You couldn't go 4 days without food in temperatures like this and expect to keep moving much longer. His body was shutting down piece by piece, first his fingers and toes going numb, then his thoughts getting fuzzy and slow, then his vision starting to gray around the edges. But Rose was still breathing, still alive inside her nest of frozen blankets. That meant he couldn't stop yet. He heard the hoofbeats before he saw anything through the thinning snow. At first, he thought he was imagining it, his mind playing tricks, conjuring sounds of rescue because his body was finally giving up. But the sound grew louder, more distinct. Not one horse, but a single rider moving carefully through deep snow. Elias's heart lurched with sudden desperate hope and immediate crushing terror. Someone was coming. That could mean salvation, a traveler who would help them, take them to safety, save Rose's life. Or it could mean something worse. The frontier was full of stories about men who found stranded travelers and took everything they had instead of helping. Papa had warned him about drifters and outlaws who preyed on the weak. Mama had taught him never to trust strangers on the trail. Elias tightened his grip on the stick and positioned himself directly in front of the crate, blocking it from view as much as his small body could manage. The rider emerged from the snow like a ghost taking shape. He was tall, taller than Papa had been, sitting straight-backed on a massive gray horse that plowed through the drifts with patient strength. He wore a long coat dark with moisture, a wide-brimmed hat pulled low, and a bandana wrapped around his face against the cold. At his hip, clearly visible, hung a revolver in a worn leather holster. The man saw Elias and pulled his horse to a stop about 20 feet away. For a long moment, neither of them moved. The rider studied the scene carefully. The destroyed wagon, the scattered supplies, the 2 snow-covered mounds that Elias had tried to bury his parents under. His eyes moved across every detail before finally settling on the small boy standing guard with a stick. Slowly, deliberately, the man reached up and pulled the bandana down from his face. He was maybe 40 years old with a hard, weathered face covered in several days of frost-coated beard. His eyes were gray and distant, the kind of eyes that had seen too much and stopped expecting good things. Deep lines creased his forehead and the corners of his mouth, making him look tired in a way that went beyond simple exhaustion. "You alone, boy?" His voice was rough, like gravel scraping against wood. Elias didn't answer. He just raised the stick higher, his arms shaking from weakness and cold. The man's eyes narrowed slightly, then shifted to look past Elias at the crate barely visible behind him. His expression didn't change, but something flickered across his face too fast to read. "That's your family?" He nodded toward the snow-covered mounds. Elias's throat was too dry to speak properly. He managed a single hoarse word. "Yeah." "How long ago?" 3 days, 2 days. Time had stopped meaning much of anything. "I don't know." The man was quiet for several seconds, his gaze moving between Elias's face and the stick and the crate. When he spoke again, his voice was slightly softer. Not gentle exactly, but less harsh. "What's in the crate, son?" Elias's jaw clenched. "Nothing." "Don't lie to me. I can hear it crying." Rose chose that exact moment to let out a weak whimper from inside her nest of blankets. The man's eyebrows rose slightly. "You got a baby in there." "She's mine." The words came out fierce despite Elias's exhaustion. "You can't have her." Something shifted in the man's expression. Surprise, maybe. Or something close to respect. He dismounted slowly, keeping his hands visible and his movements careful, the way someone might approach a wounded animal. "Easy now. I'm not here to take anything from you. Don't come closer." Elias's voice cracked but didn't waver. He planted his feet wider, ignoring the fact that his legs were shaking so badly he might collapse any second. The man stopped immediately, holding both hands out to his sides. "All right, I'm stopping, see? Not moving." They stared at each other across 20 feet of snow and wind in mutual distrust. The man spoke carefully, like he was working through a problem. "Let me guess what happened. Storm caught your family, wagon wrecked. Your folks died, left you to take care of your baby sister. You've been standing out here for 3 days, refusing to let anything hurt her. That about right?" Elias didn't confirm or deny it. He just kept the stick raised, kept his body between the stranger and Rose. The man let out a long, slow breath that fogged in the frozen air. "Hell of a thing," he muttered, more to himself than to Elias. "Hell of a damn thing." Another silence stretched between them. "My name's Caleb Mercer," the man said finally. "I run a cattle ranch about 6 miles northeast of here. Was checking my boundary fences when the storm hit, got stuck waiting it out in a line shack. Soon as the weather broke enough to travel, I started heading home. Found your wagon from the ridge." Elias said nothing. Caleb continued, his tone still careful and measured. "Now I'm going to tell you something true, boy, and I need you to listen. That baby in the crate, she's not going to survive another night out here. Neither are you. The temperature's dropping again. I can feel it in the air. Another storm's coming, probably by nightfall. You stay here, you both die. Simple as that." "Maybe," Elias's voice was barely a whisper, "but maybe you take her and I never see her again. Maybe you're lying about the ranch. Maybe you sell babies or hurt them or—" "I don't." Caleb's voice went hard and flat. "I've done plenty of things I'm not proud of, boy, but I've never hurt a child and I never will. That's a promise I can make and mean. Promises don't mean nothing." Elias surprised himself with the bitterness in his own words. "Mama promised we'd be okay. Papa promised we'd make it to the new house. Those promises didn't matter." Caleb was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke again, his voice was lower, rougher around the edges. "No, I guess they didn't." He seemed to consider something, his jaw working behind the frost-covered beard. Then he did something unexpected. He unbuckled his gun belt, held it up so Elias could see it clearly, and tossed it into the snow halfway between them. "There, my revolver. You want protection? You got it now. I'm unarmed, and you're holding the only weapon either of us has access to. If I try anything you don't like, you point that gun at me and I'll back off. Deal?" Elias stared at the gun belt lying in the snow. It was a test. Had to be. Any second now, the man would rush forward and grab it back, grab Rose, grab everything. But Caleb just stood there, hands still out to his sides, waiting. "I'm not moving until you decide, boy. But that baby's crying is getting weaker. We're running out of time." Elias looked down at Rose's crate. The crying had stopped again. That was bad. When she got too cold or too weak, she stopped making noise altogether. He looked back at Caleb, at the gun belt, at the patient gray horse standing quietly in the snow. Then he made a choice that terrified him more than anything else he'd faced in the last 3 days. He lowered the stick. Not all the way. He kept it ready at his side, prepared to swing if necessary, but enough to signal that maybe, possibly, he was willing to trust this stranger just the tiniest amount. Caleb nodded once, like something had been settled. "Smart boy. Now stay right there while I check on your sister. I'm going to move slow, and I'm going to tell you everything I'm doing before I do it. Understood?" Elias nodded stiffly. Caleb walked forward, his movements deliberately slow and telegraphed. He picked up his gun belt as he passed it, but didn't put it back on, just slung it over his shoulder out of the way. When he reached the crate, he knelt down carefully and began unwrapping the layers of frozen fabric. "Easy now, little one," he murmured, his voice going surprisingly gentle. "Let's see what we're working with here." He exposed Rose's small face, red and raw from cold, but still breathing. Her eyes were closed. Her tiny fists were curled tight against her chest. She was maybe 6 months old, impossibly fragile, and clearly near the end of her strength. Caleb's jaw tightened. He looked up at Elias with an expression that might have been anger or grief or both. "You kept her alive out here for 3 days?" Elias nodded. "With no fire, no food, and half frozen yourself?" Another nod. Caleb shook his head slowly, something like disbelief crossing his weathered face. "Most grown men couldn't do what you just did, boy. Hell, most grown men wouldn't have tried." He stood up, cradling Rose carefully against his chest, and turned to face Elias directly. Here's what's going to happen. I'm taking both of you back to my ranch. I'm going to get this baby warm, get some food in her, and make sure she survives the night. Then I'm going to do the same for you. After that, once you're both strong enough, I'll take you into Abilene, and we'll figure out what comes next. Maybe you got family there, maybe not. But first we survive. Agreed? Elias wanted to argue, wanted to demand promises and guarantees and proof that this man wasn't lying. But Rose let out another weak cry against Caleb's chest, and suddenly none of that mattered as much as getting her somewhere warm. If you hurt her, Elias started. I won't, Caleb interrupted firmly. And if you think I am, you shoot me with my own gun and take my horse. Fair enough? It wasn't fair. Nothing about this situation was fair, but it was the best offer Elias was going to get. Okay, he whispered. Caleb nodded and began wrapping Rose back up in the driest blankets he could find. Can you ride? A little. Good. You're riding with me. We're moving fast and we're not stopping until we reach the ranch. It's going to be cold and miserable, but at the end there's a fire and food and real beds. Think you can hold on that long? Elias looked at his sister bundled in the stranger's arms, looked at the gun belt now within his reach, looked at the gray horse that represented their only chance of survival. Yeah, he said, I can hold on. The ride to Mercer Ranch was the longest 6 miles of Elias's life. Caleb settled Rose carefully inside his coat to keep her warm, then lifted Elias onto the horse's back before mounting behind him. The gun belt, true to his word, Caleb had tucked into Elias's lap where the boy could reach it if needed. Hold tight to the saddle horn, Caleb instructed. If you feel yourself slipping, say something. I can't have you falling off out here. Elias gripped the horn with both hands, his numb fingers barely able to close around the leather. The horse lurched into motion, and suddenly they were moving through the frozen landscape at a steady pace that ate up ground but didn't push the animal too hard. The thinning storm still made visibility poor. Elias could see maybe 30 feet in any direction, just enough to watch the endless white plains roll past beneath them. His body swayed with the horse's rhythm, exhaustion pulling at him like a physical weight. He fought to stay awake, fought to stay alert, fought to keep track of where they were going in case he needed to escape later. But his body had other ideas. The warmth from Caleb's chest at his back, the rhythmic movement of the horse, the simple relief of no longer standing guard alone, all of it combined into an overwhelming wave of exhaustion that dragged him down despite his best efforts. His eyes slipped closed. Stay with me, boy, Caleb's voice cut through the fog. Don't you fall asleep out here. It's dangerous. I'm tired, Elias slurred. I know, but you gotta stay awake until we reach the house. Talk to me. Tell me your name. Elias. Elias what? Reed. Where you from, Elias Reed? The questions kept coming, one after another, keeping Elias tethered to consciousness through sheer irritation. He answered them in mumbled fragments. Independence, Papa's new homestead, the storm, the crash, everything falling apart. Caleb listened without commenting much, just kept asking questions whenever Elias's voice started to drift. At some point, Elias couldn't tell exactly when, the snow lightened enough to reveal actual landmarks. A line of bare cottonwoods along a frozen creek, a rocky outcropping that jutted from the plains like a broken tooth, and finally, barely visible through the gray afternoon light, the dark shape of buildings. There, Caleb said. That's home. Elias forced his eyes open wider. Through the snow, he could make out a large ranch house, a barn, several outbuildings, and a fence line stretching away in both directions. Smoke wasn't rising from the chimney, which struck him as odd. As they got closer, something else caught his attention. The front gate stood open, swinging slightly in the wind. Caleb must have noticed it too, because he suddenly tensed, his arm tightening around Elias protectively. That's not right, he muttered. What's wrong? I closed that gate when I left 4 days ago. It shouldn't be open. The horse slowed as they approached the entrance. Caleb's free hand moved to rest on his hip, where his gun should have been, but wasn't, because Elias still had the belt clutched in his lap. Fresh tracks cut through the snow, leading from the gate toward the barn. Horse tracks. Multiple animals. Someone's here, Caleb said quietly. Elias's heart began hammering again. Maybe they needed shelter from the storm. Maybe. Caleb didn't sound convinced. Or maybe they saw an empty ranch and decided to make themselves comfortable. They rode through the gates slowly, Caleb's eyes scanning every shadow and corner. The yard was quiet except for the wind. No one emerged to greet them. No smoke, no sounds, no signs of life beyond those tracks. The barn doors were closed, but not latched properly. Another thing that wouldn't happen by accident. Caleb guided the horse toward the house instead of the barn, his posture tense and wary. When they reached the porch, he dismounted carefully, still holding Rose against his chest. "Stay on the horse," he told Elias. "Don't move until I tell you. But I mean it, boy. Don't move." Caleb approached the front door with the careful steps of a man expecting trouble. He tried the handle. Unlocked. He pushed it open slowly, peering inside. From somewhere deeper in the house came the unmistakable sound of men's voices, low and conversational. Caleb's entire body went still. He backed away from the door, returned to the horse, and looked up at Elias with an expression that made the boy's stomach drop. "We've got a problem," Caleb said quietly. Before Elias could ask what kind of problem, the front door slammed open and 3 men stepped out onto the porch. They were rough-looking, dressed in mismatched trail clothes stained with dirt and old blood. All 3 were armed, 2 with revolvers holstered at their hips, 1 carrying a rifle loosely in his hands. Their faces were hard and cold, marked by old scars and the kind of eyes that had stopped caring about right and wrong a long time ago. The man in the center, tall and lean, with a sharp, angular face and graying hair tied back, smiled without warmth. "Well now," he drawled, his voice carrying a lazy menace. "Look what the storm dragged in. Mr. Mercer, I presume, we've been making use of your hospitality while waiting for the weather to break." Caleb said nothing. His hand moved toward his hip again before remembering the gun wasn't there. The tall man noticed, and his smile widened. "Looking for this?" He tapped his own revolver meaningfully. "Don't bother. We got you outnumbered and outgunned. You're going to play nice, or things are going to get real unpleasant real fast." Elias felt cold fear wash through him, different from the physical cold of the storm, deeper and more immediately dangerous. Caleb's arm tightened around Rose. "What do you want?" "What do we want?" The tall man laughed. "A warm place to sleep, food to eat, maybe a few supplies to take when we leave. Your ranch is perfect for all that, so we decided to borrow it for a while." "Take what you need and get out," Caleb said flatly. "I've got sick children who need help." The tall man's eyes shifted to Rose bundled in Caleb's coat, then up to Elias still sitting on the horse. His expression changed slightly, calculating now, recognizing vulnerability. "Children, huh? Well, that changes things, doesn't it, boys?" The other 2 men moved apart slightly, flanking Caleb on both sides. It wasn't subtle. They were surrounding him. Caleb backed up a step, positioning himself between the men and the horse, where Elias sat frozen with terror. The tall man descended the porch steps slowly, his hand resting casually on his revolver. "Here's the new arrangement, Mercer. You're going to put that baby down somewhere safe. Then you and the boy are going to go into the barn and stay there while we finish our business here. Try anything stupid, and—" He shrugged. "Well, accidents happen." "No." Caleb's voice was flat and final. The tall man stopped walking. "Excuse me? I said no. You want to rob the place, fine. But the children stay with me, and we're going inside where it's warm. That's not how this works. I don't care how it works." Something in Caleb's voice shifted, became harder, colder, absolutely certain. These kids have been through hell already. They need shelter, food, and medicine. You want to be thieves, be thieves. But you're not putting sick children back out in the cold. I don't care how many guns you have. The tall man studied him for a long moment, his smile fading into something more dangerous. "You'd die for a couple of strays you just picked up?" "Yes." The word hung in the frozen air like a challenge. One of the other men, shorter with a badly scarred face, laughed nervously. "Come on, Pike. They're just kids. Let them inside. What's the harm?" Pike, the tall leader, shot him an irritated look. "The harm is they're witnesses, you idiot. Witnesses who can describe us to the law in Abilene." "They're children," Caleb repeated, "and they're not going anywhere. Final answer." Pike's hand moved toward his gun. Everything happened at once. Caleb lunged sideways, pushing Elias and the horse back while shielding Rose with his body. Pike drew his revolver. The scarred man shouted something. The third man raised his rifle, and a shot cracked through the air. Elias didn't see who fired. He just saw Pike stagger backward, blood blooming across his shoulder, saw Caleb moving impossibly fast toward the barn, still holding Rose, saw the other two men scatter in different directions. "Get inside!" Caleb roared at Elias. "The house! Now!" The horse, spooked by gunfire, reared up slightly. Elias clung to the saddle horn desperately, his numb fingers barely holding on. The gun belt slipped from his lap and fell into the snow. More shots rang out. Elias couldn't tell where they were coming from or who was shooting at whom. Everything dissolved into chaos and noise and terror. The horse bolted toward the barn, carrying Elias with it. He heard Caleb shouting something behind him, but couldn't make out the words over the pounding hoofbeats and his own panicked breathing. The barn doors loomed ahead, partly open. The horse plunged through them into darkness. Inside the barn, Elias finally lost his grip. He tumbled from the saddle, hit the ground hard, and rolled through dirty straw and snow. Pain exploded through his shoulder and hip. Stars burst across his vision. When his head cleared, the gunshots had stopped. Terrible silence filled the ranch yard. Elias dragged himself to his feet, swaying with dizziness. His whole body hurt. His vision kept blurring. He stumbled toward the barn doors, trying to see what happened. Through the opening, he could see shapes moving in the yard. Caleb was nowhere visible. Neither was Rose. The three men were shouting at each other, arguing about something. Then Pike's voice rose above the others. "Find that baby. She's our leverage now." Elias's blood turned to ice. They were going to take Rose. After everything, after 3 days of keeping her alive, after finally finding help, after making it this far, these men were going to take her anyway. No. The word burned through his exhaustion and fear like a brand. No, not happening, not ever. Elias looked around the barn wildly, searching for anything he could use. The place was mostly empty, old straw, broken tools, a few empty feed sacks. But hanging on the far wall, barely visible in the dim light, was something that made his heart leap. A rifle. Old and probably unloaded, but a rifle nonetheless. He stumbled across the barn, grabbed it off the wall, and checked the mechanism the way he'd seen Papa do 1,000 times. Empty, completely empty, no ammunition anywhere visible. Didn't matter. It looked real. That might be enough. Elias heard boots crunching through snow, approaching the barn. He looked up at the hayloft above, at the ladder leading up to it, at the dark shadows where someone small could hide. A plan formed in his exhausted mind, desperate and stupid, and probably impossible, but the only plan he had. He began to climb. Behind him, the barn doors creaked open wider as the scarred man stepped inside, rifle raised, eyes scanning the darkness. "Come on out, boy," he called. "We don't want to hurt you, just want to talk." Elias reached the hayloft and pressed himself flat against the dusty floor, the empty rifle clutched tight against his chest. From up here he could see down into the barn through gaps in the floorboards, could see the scarred man moving cautiously forward, searching, could see the perfect spot where a trap might work. Elias Reed was 6 years old, had been awake for 3 days straight, was half-starved and mostly frozen, and had absolutely no idea how to fight grown men with guns. But Rose was alive. Still alive because he'd refused to let her die. And that promise wasn't finished yet. Not by a damn sight. The scarred man moved through the barn like he had all the time in the world, his rifle sweeping left and right across the shadows. His boots scraped against frozen straw with each deliberate step, the sound echoing up into the rafters where Elias lay perfectly still. "I know you're in here, boy." The man's voice carried a false friendliness that made Elias's skin crawl. "Saw the horse come running in. You fall off? You hurt?" Elias pressed his cheek harder against the rough floorboards, watching through a gap as the man stopped directly beneath the hayloft. One wrong move, one creak of old wood, and the hiding spot would become a trap instead of an advantage. "Listen, kid, nobody wants to hurt you. We're just trying to survive the same as you are. That baby you got, she needs medicine, right? Food? We got supplies. We can help." Lies. All of it lies. Elias had heard enough of Papa's stories about frontier drifters to know how this worked. These men didn't help people. They took what they wanted and left bodies behind. The scarred man took another step forward, putting him almost perfectly in position. Elias could see the loose boards above the feed trough, boards he'd noticed when he first climbed up here. Old wood, rotted through in places. held together mostly by hope and a few rusty nails. If those boards gave way under enough weight, anything sitting on them would crash straight down into the trough below. It wouldn't kill anyone, probably, but it might stun them long enough for Elias to run. The problem was making it happen without getting shot in the process. Elias's hands were shaking so badly he could barely hold the empty rifle. His whole body trembled from cold, exhaustion, and pure animal terror. He was 6 years old, weighed nothing, and was about to try something that would probably get him killed. But Rose was out there somewhere, and these men wanted to use her as leverage, which meant she was in danger, which meant Elias had exactly zero choice about what came next. He shifted his weight carefully, testing the floorboards beneath him. They creaked softly. The scarred man's head snapped up toward the sound. "There you are." The rifle barrel came up, aiming into the darkness of the loft. Elias moved. He didn't think about it, didn't plan it out, just acted on pure desperate instinct. He rolled sideways across the hayloft floor toward the weakest section of boards, putting all his meager weight onto the rotted planks. Wood cracked like a gunshot. The scarred man fired into the loft, the bullet punching through the space where Elias had been lying a second earlier. The muzzle flash lit up the barn interior in stark white light. Then the floor gave way completely. Elias didn't fall. He'd grabbed onto a support beam at the last second, his fingers screaming in protest as they took his full weight. But the cascade of broken boards, old straw, and accumulated debris fell exactly where he'd hoped it would, crashing down onto the scarred man below. The man shouted in surprise and pain as heavy timber slammed into his shoulders and head, driving him to his knees. His rifle clattered away across the barn floor. More debris rained down, burying him under a pile of splintered wood and rotting hay. Elias's grip was already failing. His frozen fingers couldn't hold on much longer. He let go and dropped the 8 feet to the ground, hitting hard enough to knock the wind from his lungs. Pain shot through his legs, but he forced himself up, scrambling toward the barn entrance while the scarred man thrashed and cursed beneath the pile of wreckage. He burst out into the ranch yard and immediately wished he hadn't. The scene had gotten worse. Pike was on the porch, one hand pressed against his bleeding shoulder, while the other held his revolver aimed at something inside the house. The third man, younger than the others, with nervous eyes and quick movements, stood guard near the barn with his gun drawn. When he saw Elias emerge, his eyes went wide. "Pike, the kid's running!" Pike's head swiveled toward Elias with frightening speed. "Grab him!" The nervous man lunged forward. Elias tried to dodge, tried to run, but his exhausted legs tangled beneath him and he went down hard in the snow. Rough hands grabbed his arms, yanked him upright, dragged him backward. "Got him!" "Bring him here," Pike ordered. Elias fought with everything he had left, kicking and twisting and trying to break free, but he was so weak now that his struggles barely registered. The nervous man hauled him up the porch steps and shoved him against the wall beside the door. Pike loomed over him, blood still seeping between his fingers where he clutched his wounded shoulder. Up close, his face was even harder than it had seemed from a distance, all sharp angles and cold calculation. His eyes were the pale gray of dirty ice. "Where's Mercer?" Pike demanded. Elias said nothing. His heart hammered so hard he thought it might burst. Pike backhanded him across the face. The blow wasn't hard enough to cause real damage, but it snapped Elias's head sideways and brought tears to his eyes. Pain bloomed across his cheek, hot and immediate. "I asked you a question, boy. Where is he?" "Don't know," Elias gasped. His voice came out weak and broken. "Lost him when the shooting started." Pike studied him for a long moment, then seemed to decide he was telling the truth. He turned to the nervous man. "Go check the barn. Your partner went in there and hasn't come back out." "What about the kid?" "He stays with me. Insurance, in case Mercer's hiding somewhere waiting to play hero." Pike grabbed Elias by the collar and dragged him through the front door into the ranch house. The interior was simple but solid. A main room with a stone fireplace, a kitchen area in the back, stairs leading up to what must be bedrooms. The furniture was sparse and practical, nothing fancy. It looked like the home of someone who lived alone and didn't see the point in comfort. Pike kicked the door shut behind them and shoved Elias toward a heavy wooden chair near the cold fireplace. "Sit. Don't move. If you try to run again, I'll shoot you in the leg and you'll bleed out before anyone can help. Understand?" Elias sat. He understood perfectly. Pike moved to the window, keeping his gun ready while he watched the yard through the glass. His wounded shoulder was still bleeding, staining his shirt dark red. It had to hurt, badly, but his gun hand remained steady. "Smart man, you're Mercer," Pike said conversationally, still watching outside. "Saw us coming and grabbed the baby before anyone could stop him. Disappeared into the storm before we could get a bead on him. That baby's probably frozen by now, exposed to this cold." The words hit Elias like physical blows. Rose. Caleb had taken Rose and run into the blizzard. To save her from these men, he'd carried her back out into the very cold that had nearly killed her already. She wouldn't survive it. Not again. Not after everything. "You're lying," Elias whispered. "Maybe." Pike glanced back at him with something that might have been amusement. "Or maybe your hero got that baby killed trying to save her. Funny how that works sometimes." Elias's hands curled into fists. He wanted to scream, wanted to attack this man with his bare hands, wanted to make him hurt the way Rose must be hurting out there in the cold. But he couldn't. He was trapped, helpless, and absolutely useless. The front door banged open. The nervous man stumbled in, supporting the scarred man who was bleeding from a cut on his forehead and limping badly. "What the hell happened to you?" Pike demanded. "Kid dropped half the damn barn on me," the scarred man growled, shooting Elias a look of pure hatred. "Little bastard set a trap." Pike's eyebrows rose slightly. He looked at Elias with new assessment, something almost like respect flickering across his face before disappearing. "Resourceful, I'll give you that." The scarred man collapsed into another chair, pressing his hand against his bleeding head. "We need to get out of here, Pike. This is going bad fast. Take what we came for and ride out before the law shows up." "Law's not coming," Pike said flatly. "Storm's still too bad for travel from town. We got time." "What about Mercer?" "What about him? He's out there somewhere in the cold with a dying baby. He's not thinking straight right now. When he comes back, and he will come back because that's what heroes do, we'll be ready for him." Pike's smile was cold and certain. "And this time, we won't miss." The nervous man shifted uncomfortably. "I don't like this. Killing a kid, Pike, that's different from what we usually do." "We're not killing any kids," Pike snapped. "We're defending ourselves against a man who shot me. If the boy gets caught in the crossfire, that's Mercer's fault for trying to be noble." It was all twisted logic, excuses piled on top of lies, but Pike said it with such conviction that Elias almost believed he believed it himself. The scarred man groaned and touched his head wound gingerly. "I need bandages, whiskey, something." Pike jerked his head toward the kitchen. "Go look! This is a ranch. There's got to be medical supplies somewhere." While the two injured men rummaged through Caleb's belongings, Pike returned his attention to the window. The storm was picking up again, snow falling heavier, visibility dropping fast. Whatever opening in the weather they'd had was closing. Elias sat perfectly still, his mind racing. He needed to get out of here, needed to find Caleb and Rose, needed to warn them, or help them, or do something other than sit in this chair waiting for everything to fall apart. But how? He was one exhausted child against 3 armed men in a house with only one exit. Even if he made it outside, where would he go? He didn't know the area. Didn't know where Caleb might have taken Rose. Didn't know anything except that every minute sitting here was another minute Rose spent dying in the cold. The helplessness was worse than the fear. Then he heard it, so faint he almost missed it beneath the wind, a soft creak from somewhere above them, from upstairs. Pike heard it too, his whole body tensed, his gun coming up to aim at the ceiling. Another creak. Definitely footsteps. Someone was moving around up there, trying to be quiet but not quite succeeding. The scarred man emerged from the kitchen holding a bottle of whiskey and some rags. "What is it?" "Upstairs," Pike whispered. "We're not alone." All 3 men moved at once, spreading out across the room with their weapons ready. The nervous man positioned himself at the base of the stairs. Pike and the scarred man took up positions with clear lines of sight to the second-floor landing. "Mercer," Pike called out, "I know you're up there. Come down with your hands visible, or I start shooting through the ceiling." Silence answered him. Then, after a long, tense moment, a voice drifted down from above. "Let the boy go first, then we'll talk." It was Caleb's voice, rough and tired, but absolutely firm. He was alive. He was here, which meant Rose might be here too. Pike smiled without warmth. "Not how this works, friend. You come down, or I put a bullet in the kid's head. Your choice. Do that, and you lose your leverage. I stay upstairs, you stay trapped downstairs, and we wait to see who runs out of patience first. I've got all the patience in the world. Really? Caleb's voice carried a dark amusement. Because that shoulder wound looks like it's bleeding pretty good from here. How long before you pass out from blood loss? An hour? 2? Pike's jaw tightened. The comment had struck close to truth. His face was pale, his movement slightly sluggish. He was weakening. I'll make you a deal, Caleb continued. You walk out of here right now, leave the boy and everything else, and I won't follow you. You've got a head start before the storm clears enough for me to notify the law. Take it. Or, Pike challenged, or I burn this house down with all of us inside it. I've already doused the upstairs in lamp oil. One match, and the whole place goes up like kindling. I'm dead anyway if you win, so I've got nothing to lose. The scarred man swore viciously. He's bluffing. Maybe, Pike said. But he didn't sound certain anymore. Elias could smell it now, the sharp chemical scent of kerosene drifting down from the second floor. Caleb wasn't bluffing. He'd actually done it, turned his own home into a potential funeral pyre. The standoff stretched out, tension building like a physical pressure in the room. Nobody moved, nobody spoke. The only sound was the howling wind outside and the occasional creak of old wood settling. Then Rose started crying. The sound came from upstairs, thin and weak but unmistakable. She was alive. Caleb had her hidden somewhere up there. Pike's expression changed, calculation sliding back into place. You bring a baby into this? Make her part of your suicide plan? What kind of man does that? The kind who knows you'll kill us all anyway if I surrender, Caleb shot back. At least this way we all go together. You don't get to walk away clean. It was insane, completely insane. Elias stared at the ceiling with wide eyes, unable to believe what he was hearing. Caleb was willing to burn them all alive rather than let these men win. The nervous man broke first. Forget this, Pike. He's crazy. Let's just take what we can carry and get out while we still can. Shut up, Pike hissed. I'm serious. You want to die over some ranch supplies? Over a stranger's pride? I didn't sign up for this. The scarred man shifted uncomfortably. He's got a point. This has gone sideways. Pike's face twisted with fury, but beneath it Elias could see something else. Recognition that he was losing control of the situation. His men were scared. He was wounded. And Caleb had just proven he was willing to do something Pike wasn't. Die to protect what mattered. Fine, Pike spat. We're leaving, but this isn't over, Mercer. I'll remember your face. I'll remember this ranch. And one day when you're not expecting it, I'll come back and finish what we started here. Looking forward to it, Caleb said flatly. Pike grabbed Elias by the arm, yanking him to his feet. The boy comes with us until we're clear of the property, then we let him go. No deal. Leave him now. Not negotiable. He's our guarantee you don't shoot us in the back the second we step outside. A pause from upstairs. Then, you heard him and the match drops. I mean it. I believe you. Pike dragged Elias toward the door, keeping the gun pressed against his side. That's why this is going to work. They moved as a group, Pike holding Elias hostage, the other 2 men backing toward the exit with their weapons ready. When they reached the door, the nervous man eased it open and peered outside into the storm. Horses are still in the barn. We grab them and ride. Do it fast, Pike ordered. They stepped out onto the porch, and immediately the wind hit them like a wall. The storm had intensified again, snow driving horizontally across the yard, temperature plummeting. Visibility was maybe 10 feet. Perfect cover for an ambush. The thought had barely formed in Elias's mind when gunfire erupted from somewhere near the barn. The nervous man went down immediately, a red flower blooming on his chest. He hit the porch and didn't move. The scarred man dove for cover behind a water trough, returning fire blindly into the storm. Pike dragged Elias off the porch and used him as a shield, backing toward the barn while keeping low. Where is he? Do you see him? No, can't see anything. The scarred man's voice was panicked now. Another shot rang out. The bullet sparked off the water trough inches from the scarred man's head. Caleb was out there somewhere, hidden in the snow and wind, picking them apart one by one. He'd never gone upstairs at all. That had been a trick, a way to make them lower their guard. The kerosene, the threats, all of it had been misdirection while he got into position outside. Pike realized it at the same moment Elias did. It was a setup. The bastard was never inside. What do? We run. Get to the horses and run." They broke for the barn, moving fast through the deep snow. Elias stumbled, his legs barely working anymore, and Pike half carried, half dragged him along. Behind them, the scarred man was screaming something incoherent, his words lost in the wind. They made it to the barn doors. Pike kicked them open and shoved Elias inside, then turned to cover the scarred man's approach. That's when Caleb stepped out of the storm behind them. He'd circled around while they were focused on the barn, moving silently through the blizzard. He was covered in snow, his face barely visible, his revolver steady in his hand. "Drop it," he said. Pike spun, bringing his gun up. Caleb fired first. The bullet took Pike in the leg, shattering his knee and dropping him instantly. He screamed and fell, his gun tumbling away into the snow. The scarred man made the mistake of trying to be a hero. He raised his rifle toward Caleb's back. Caleb was already moving, already turning, already firing. 2 shots, quick and precise. The scarred man staggered backward and sat down hard in the snow, a confused expression on his face. Then he toppled over sideways and stopped moving. Just like that, it was finished. The gunfire stopped. The screaming stopped. Only the wind remained, howling across the ranch yard like it was mourning the violence. Caleb stood there for a moment, breathing hard, his gun still raised. Then he seemed to remember Elias, and his expression changed to immediate concern. "You hurt, boy?" Elias shook his head. He couldn't speak. Everything that had just happened was too much, too fast, too overwhelming. Caleb hurried over, stepping around Pike, who was clutching his ruined leg and sobbing in the snow. He knelt in front of Elias and checked him over quickly but thoroughly, looking for injuries, blood, broken bones. "You did good," Caleb said quietly, dropping that barn debris on one of them, staying alive until I could get into position. "You did real good." "Rose," Elias managed. "Where's Rose?" "Safe. I hid her in the storm cellar, under a pile of blankets before I ever came into the house. She's cold, but alive." Caleb stood and offered his hand. "Come on. Let's get you both inside where it's warm." They left Pike bleeding in the snow and walked together toward the house. Behind them, the wounded man called out weakly for help that wasn't coming. Caleb didn't look back. Inside the ranch house, Caleb moved fast and efficient. He got a fire roaring in the stone fireplace, pulled out extra blankets from a trunk, and then disappeared outside to retrieve Rose from the cellar. When he returned carrying the baby, Elias nearly broke down. Rose was still breathing, still alive, still crying softly. She'd survived again. Caleb placed her gently on a nest of blankets near the fire, then turned his attention to Elias. "You need to eat. When's the last time you had food?" "Don't remember." "Right, stay here." Caleb went to the kitchen and returned with bread, cold meat, and water. He set it in front of Elias and didn't say anything else, just waited while the boy ate with shaking hands. The food tasted like nothing. Elias's mouth was too dry, his throat too tight, but he forced it down anyway because his body needed it, and because Rose needed him to stay strong. After eating, exhaustion crashed over him like a physical weight. His eyes kept closing despite his best efforts. His head drooped. "Sleep," Caleb said. "I'll watch Rose. I'll watch the door. You're safe now. The men outside will either die in the storm or survive to face the law when I ride into town tomorrow. Either way, they're not our problem anymore." Caleb pulled a blanket over Elias's shoulders. "Sleep, Elias. That's an order." Elias wanted to argue, wanted to stay awake and keep watch like he'd been doing for days, but his body betrayed him. He slumped sideways into the blankets near the fire, and within seconds he was gone, dropping into sleep so deep it felt like drowning. He dreamed of snow and wolves and his mother's voice singing lullabies that got quieter and quieter until they disappeared entirely. When he woke, hours had passed. The fire had burned down to coals. Gray dawn light filtered through the windows. And sitting in a chair near the door, keeping watch with his rifle across his lap, Caleb Mercer looked like he hadn't slept at all. Elias sat up slowly, every muscle in his body screaming in protest. He was warm for the first time in days. Properly warm, not the fake warmth of hypothermia, but actual heat from the fire and blankets. Rose was asleep in a basket near the hearth, her tiny chest rising and falling steadily. Caleb noticed Elias was awake and nodded. "Storm broke about an hour ago. I'll be riding into Abilene soon as the sun's fully up to notify the law about what happened." What about... Elias trailed off, not sure how to finish the question. The man outside? Dead. Froze sometime in the night. I'll have the sheriff collect the bodies when he comes. Caleb said it matter-of-factly, like he was discussing the weather. You don't need to see any of that. You and Rose will stay here where it's warm. Elias nodded slowly. He should probably feel something about men dying, guilt or horror or sadness. But all he felt was numb relief that they couldn't hurt Rose anymore. What happens to us? The question came out smaller than he'd intended. After you go to town, I mean. Caleb was quiet for a long moment. He set the rifle aside and leaned forward, elbows on his knees, his weathered face thoughtful. That's up to you, he said finally. You got family in Abilene? Someone who can take you and your sister? Elias shook his head. Parents were from Independence. Don't know anyone out here. Then I expect the law will want to put you in an orphanage. Split you up, probably. Babies usually get adopted fast, but boys your age... He shrugged. Harder to place. The words hit Elias like ice water, split them up. Send Rose to one family and him to another, or worse, leave him in an institution while Rose grew up never knowing she had a brother who'd kept her alive through the worst days of both their lives. No. The word came out fierce and absolute. She stays with me. That's not your choice to make, son. I don't care. I made a promise. She stays with me. Caleb studied him for a long moment, something unreadable passing across his face. Then he stood and walked to the window, staring out at the frozen landscape bathed in weak morning light. Tell you what, he said slowly. When I go into town, I'll talk to the sheriff. Explain the situation. See if there's any way to keep you two together. And if there's not? Caleb turned back to face him, and for the first time since they'd met, something almost like warmth showed in those hard gray eyes. Then I guess I'll figure something else out. It wasn't a promise, wasn't a guarantee, but it was something, and right now something was all Elias had. He looked at Rose sleeping peacefully by the fire, then back at Caleb standing watch by the window, then down at his own hands, scratched and raw and still shaking slightly from everything they'd been through. Somehow, impossibly, they'd survived. All three of them. Against the storm, against the outlaws, against odds that should have killed them a dozen times over. That had to mean something, didn't it? Outside, the Kansas plains stretched away endlessly under fresh snow, beautiful and terrible, and completely indifferent to the small dramas played out across its frozen surface. The sun climbed higher, burning off the last traces of storm clouds, revealing a world scrubbed clean and starting over. Inside Mercer Ranch, three people who barely knew each other sat together in the warmth, bound by violence and survival and the fragile possibility of something that might eventually become family. The hardest part was just beginning. Caleb left for Abilene 2 hours after sunrise, riding his gray horse through snow that came up past the animal's knees in places. He'd wrapped himself in extra layers, loaded his saddlebags with supplies, and checked his revolver 3 times before mounting up. Before he rode out, he'd looked back at the ranch house where Elias stood watching from the window, Rose bundled in his arms. Bar the door after I leave, Caleb had instructed. Don't open it for anyone except me. I'll knock 3 times, pause, then twice more. That's how you'll know it's safe. Elias had nodded, already memorizing the pattern. There's food in the pantry. Keep the fire going. If Rose seems sick, fever, trouble breathing, anything, there's medicine in the cabinet above the sink. Willow bark tea for fever, honey for cough. Caleb had paused, his hand on the saddle horn. You'll be all right? Yeah. It hadn't been convincing, but Caleb had accepted it anyway. He'd swung up onto his horse and ridden out without looking back again, his figure disappearing into the white landscape like he'd never existed at all. Now Elias stood alone in the ranch house with his baby sister, the silence pressing down like a physical weight. The bodies outside were covered with snow by now. He couldn't see them from the windows, which was better. He'd barred the door like Caleb said. He'd checked Rose 3 times in the last 20 minutes. He'd added wood to the fire. And still the quiet felt wrong. Too empty. Too exposed. He kept expecting something terrible to happen. More men showing up, wolves breaking through the windows, the roof caving in. His mind kept inventing disasters because that's what the last week had taught him. Safety was temporary, and disaster was always waiting just around the corner. Rose started fussing in her basket, her small face scrunching up in that way that meant she was about to start crying. Elias picked her up carefully, supporting her head the way Mama had shown him back when the world still made sense. "You're okay," he whispered. "We're okay. Caleb's coming back." He didn't know if he believed it. Adults kept leaving and not coming back. That was just how things worked now. But Rose seemed to accept his words. She settled against his chest, her tiny hand curling around his finger with surprising strength. She was warmer than she'd been yesterday, stronger. The food and shelter were working. Elias carried her to the window and stood there watching the empty road that led toward town. Nothing moved except wind-driven snow and the occasional branch bending under accumulated ice. The world looked peaceful and deadly in equal measure. Hours crawled past. Morning became afternoon. The sun tracked across the pale winter sky, providing light but almost no warmth. Elias fed Rose with milk Caleb had left warming by the fire. He ate bread and dried meat without tasting it. He paced the room, unable to sit still, unable to relax even slightly. What if Caleb didn't come back? What if the law decided to arrest him for the shooting? What if the storm returned and trapped him in town? What if he simply decided 2 orphans weren't worth the trouble and stayed away? Elias had no plan for any of those scenarios. He was 6 years old, had no money, no horse, no supplies beyond what was in this house. If Caleb abandoned them, they'd be right back where they started, alone and helpless on the Kansas frontier in the middle of winter. The thought terrified him more than the outlaws had. Afternoon faded into early evening. The light took on that peculiar gray-gold quality that meant sunset wasn't far off. Still no sign of Caleb. Still nothing but empty plains and gathering darkness. Elias was feeding more wood into the fire when he heard hoofbeats approaching. His heart lurched. He set Rose quickly in her basket and grabbed the iron poker from beside the fireplace, the only weapon within reach. He moved to the window and peered out carefully, staying back from the glass. 2 riders were coming up the road toward the ranch. One was Caleb on his gray horse. The other was a stranger on a black mare, wearing a heavy coat and a star-shaped badge visible even at this distance. The law had come. Elias's stomach twisted into knots. This was it. The moment they'd take Rose away, split them up, send him to an orphanage, and her to some family who'd never know what she'd survived, or what Elias had done to keep her alive. He wanted to run, wanted to grab Rose and hide somewhere these men couldn't find them. But there was nowhere to go, and running would only make things worse. The riders stopped in front of the house. Caleb dismounted, said something to the lawman that Elias couldn't hear through the window, then approached the door. 3 knocks, pause, 2 more. Elias stood there frozen for several seconds before finally forcing himself to move. He set down the poker, unbarred the door, and pulled it open. Caleb looked tired and cold, but otherwise unchanged. Behind him, the lawman was dismounting. A heavy-set man in his 50s with a thick mustache and eyes that missed nothing. "Elias," Caleb said, "this is Sheriff Porter from Abilene. He needs to ask you some questions about what happened yesterday." The sheriff stepped forward, studying Elias with an expression somewhere between sympathy and professional assessment. "Son, I need you to tell me everything that happened from the moment you and Mr. Mercer arrived at this ranch. Take your time. Start from the beginning." So Elias told the story again. The arrival, finding the outlaws inside, the confrontation, the shooting, hiding in the barn, being taken hostage, Caleb's trick with the kerosene threat, the final gunfight in the storm. He kept his voice flat and factual, like he was reporting on events that had happened to someone else. Sheriff Porter listened without interrupting, his face giving nothing away. When Elias finished, the lawman was quiet for a long moment. "That matches what Mercer told me," he said finally. "I've already examined the bodies. Clear case of self-defense, far as I can tell. The men you described were wanted for robbery and murder across 3 territories. You're lucky to be alive, boy." Elias didn't feel lucky. He felt tired and scared and so far beyond his ability to process what was happening that everything seemed distant and unreal. "What about us?" he asked. "Me and Rose. What happens now?" Porter's expression softened slightly. "Well, that's complicated. Normally, children in your situation would be placed with the orphanage in town until permanent arrangements could be made. However," he glanced at Caleb, "Mr. Mercer has made a rather unusual request." Caleb stepped forward, his weathered face unreadable. I've asked the sheriff if there's any legal way for the children to stay here at the ranch temporarily, just until spring, when travel's safer and we can look for relatives back east who might take them. Elias's heart jumped. Stay here. It's not ideal, Porter said carefully. You're a single man living alone, Mercer. No wife, no family. The town council's going to have opinions about you trying to keep 2 young children out here. Let them have opinions, Caleb said flatly. Doesn't change the facts. These kids survived hell together. Splitting them up now seems cruel, and sending them to an orphanage during the worst winter in 20 years seems dangerous. They're safer here. Are they? Porter's tone sharpened. You had 3 armed outlaws break into your home yesterday. You had a shootout with a 6-year-old present. That sounds safe to you? Safer than they were when I found them dying in the snow, Caleb shot back. And safer than they'll be in some overcrowded orphanage where nobody knows their story or gives a damn if they stay together. The 2 men stared at each other, tension crackling in the air. Elias held his breath, afraid any sound might tip the balance the wrong way. Finally, Porter sighed. I'll need to speak with the council, get their approval. But he looked at Elias, then at Rose, sleeping peacefully by the fire. Temporarily. Until spring. We revisit the situation then and make proper arrangements. Agreed? Agreed, Caleb said immediately. Porter turned to Elias. That work for you, son? Elias didn't trust his voice. He just nodded. All right then. Porter moved toward the door, then paused. Mercer, you understand what you're taking on here. These aren't just mouths to feed. That boy's been through trauma that would break grown men. The baby needs constant care. You're not equipped for this. I'll manage, Caleb said. You better do more than manage. I'll be checking in regularly. Any sign these children aren't being properly cared for, and they're going straight to the orphanage. Understood? Understood. Porter nodded and left, closing the door firmly behind him. His horse's hoofbeats faded into the distance, leaving only silence. Caleb stood there for a moment, staring at the closed door like he was surprised by what he'd just committed to. Then he turned and met Elias's wide-eyed gaze. This is temporary, he said, his tone firm. Don't go thinking this is permanent, or that I'm adopting you or any fool notion like that. Come spring, we find you proper family, real family, people who know how to raise children. Clear? Clear, Elias whispered. Good. Now help me unload the supplies I brought from town. We've got work to do. The next weeks unfolded in a strange rhythm that felt nothing like family and everything like survival training. Caleb wasn't cruel, but he wasn't gentle either. He set rules and expected them followed without argument. He assigned chores appropriate for a 6-year-old, gathering kindling, feeding chickens, helping with simple meal preparation. He taught Elias how to properly care for Rose, changing her, feeding her, recognizing signs of illness. But he never touched either of them unnecessarily, never hugged or comforted or offered the kind of physical affection parents normally gave. He was more like a drill sergeant training recruits than a guardian caring for children. Elias didn't mind. He didn't want affection from this stranger. He wanted Rose safe and warm and alive. And Caleb provided that. Everything else was extra. The nightmare started about a week after they'd settled in. Elias would wake in the middle of the night gasping for air, certain he was back in the storm, certain Rose had stopped breathing, certain his parents were dying all over again. He'd stumble to her cradle and check her breathing over and over until his hands stopped shaking. Caleb never said anything about it. But Elias noticed that on the nights when the nightmares were worst, Caleb would stay up later than usual, keeping watch from his chair by the fire, as if standing guard against whatever demons haunted the boy's sleep. 3 weeks in, a late-night blizzard hit the ranch harder than anything since the storm that had killed Elias's parents. The wind howled like something alive and furious, battering the walls and rattling windows. Snow piled against the door so high they couldn't have opened it if they'd wanted to. Elias woke to Rose screaming, really screaming, not her usual fussing. He scrambled out of bed and found her burning with fever, her small face flushed red, her breathing rapid and shallow. Caleb! The panic in his voice brought the rancher running. Caleb took one look and moved into action. He stripped Rose down to cool her skin, prepared willow bark tea, held her while Elias dripped tiny amounts between her lips. He worked with calm efficiency, but Elias could see the tension in his jaw, the way his hands moved just slightly too fast. She'll be all right, Caleb said. Babies spike fevers. It's normal. She's not all right. Look at her. I am looking, and I'm telling you she'll be fine if we keep her cool and get fluids in her. You don't know that. You can't know that. What if... Elias couldn't finish the sentence. Caleb set Rose down carefully and gripped Elias's shoulders, forcing the boy to meet his eyes. Listen to me. She's not dying. I've seen dying, and this isn't it. She's got a fever, and we're treating it. And come morning, she'll be better. You hear me? Elias wanted to believe him, desperately wanted to trust that this man knew what he was talking about. But trust had become a foreign concept. They stayed up all night together, taking turns holding Rose, monitoring her temperature, working to bring the fever down degree by degree. Caleb told stories to distract Elias, ranch tales, cattle drive disasters, the time a spring tornado had destroyed half his property and he'd rebuilt it alone. The stories weren't particularly comforting, but they gave Elias something to focus on besides his terror. By dawn, Rose's fever had broken. She slept peacefully, her breathing normal, her skin cool. Elias collapsed beside her cradle and finally let himself cry. Quiet, exhausted tears that came from somewhere deep and broken. Caleb didn't try to stop him or comfort him. He just sat nearby keeping watch, his rifle across his lap, standing guard against nothing and everything. When Elias finally ran out of tears, Caleb spoke quietly. You can't protect her from everything, boy. Fevers happen. Sickness happens. Life happens. All you can do is be there when it does and fight it the best you can. That's not enough. Maybe not. But it's all any of us get. Winter deepened. January became February. The snow never seemed to stop falling, and the temperature stayed brutal enough to kill anyone caught outside unprepared. But inside the ranch house, a strange kind of routine developed. Elias learned to cook simple meals. He learned to mend clothes. He learned to read by firelight using old newspapers Caleb kept stacked in a corner. He learned that Caleb had nightmares too. The rancher would wake sometimes in the middle of the night and sit by the window for hours, staring out at nothing with an expression of such profound loneliness that it made Elias uncomfortable to witness. They didn't talk about it, didn't talk about much of anything beyond the practical necessities of daily survival. But somehow, without either of them noticing exactly when it happened, they stopped being a rancher and two orphans sharing a house and started becoming something else, something that almost resembled a family, even if none of them would have used that word. The turning point came in late February during a rare clear day when Caleb decided to take Elias outside to check the fence lines and teach him basic ranch work. They bundled up against the cold and trudged through snow that came up to Elias's waist in places. Rose stayed behind in her cradle near the fire. Caleb had judged it safe enough for an hour's absence, and Elias had reluctantly agreed. Walking away from the ranch house felt wrong. Every step increased the distance between Elias and his sister, increased the number of things that could go wrong while he wasn't watching. But Caleb kept a steady pace, and eventually they reached the western fence line where several posts had been damaged by the weight of accumulated ice. Pay attention, Caleb said, showing Elias how to test the stability of a fence post, how to identify rot, how to make field repairs with wire and muscle. A rancher's only as good as his fences. They keep your animals in and trouble out. You neglect them, and both will make your life hell. Elias tried to focus on the lesson, but his attention kept drifting back toward the ranch house, barely visible in the distance. Caleb noticed. She's fine. Stop worrying. I can't. Yes, you can. Part of keeping her safe is knowing when she doesn't need you watching every second. Easy for you to say. You're not the one who promised to protect her. Caleb was quiet for several seconds, his hands still working the wire. Then he said, I had a family once, wife and a daughter about Rose's age, maybe a little older. Elias went still. Caleb never talked about his past, never mentioned anything before the ranch. Sickness took them both about 8 years back, Caleb continued, his voice flat and emotionless. Fever, like what Rose had the other week. Burned through them so fast there wasn't time to get a doctor, wasn't time for anything except watching them die and being completely helpless to stop it. He straightened up, tested the fence post, and moved to the next damaged section. I promised my wife I'd protect our daughter. Swore it when she was born, swore it every day after. Meant it more than I've ever meant anything. Didn't matter. She died anyway, and so did my wife, and all my promises were worth exactly nothing. Elias didn't know what to say. The raw pain in Caleb's words, delivered in that flat monotone, was worse somehow than if he'd been crying. Point is, Caleb said, you can't control everything. You can do your absolute best and still lose. That's just how life works on the frontier. It's cruel and random, and it doesn't care how hard you try. Then why do you try at all? Caleb looked at him directly for the first time since starting the story. Because what else is there? You quit trying, you might as well lie down in the snow and wait for death. At least trying means you're still fighting. They worked in silence for a while longer, repairing fence posts and clearing ice from wire. The sun climbed higher, warming the air just slightly, making the snow sparkle like someone had scattered diamonds across the plains. On the walk back, Caleb spoke again. When spring comes and we start looking for your relatives, what are you hoping we find? Elias considered the question carefully. Someone who'll keep us together. And if we can't find anyone like that, then we don't go. Caleb stopped walking. That's not how this works. Sheriff Porter was clear. I don't care what he was clear about, Elias interrupted, surprised by the fierceness in his own voice. I'm not letting Rose go to some family that splits us up. I kept her alive through that storm. I kept her alive when you weren't there. She's mine to protect, and I'm not giving that up. Caleb stared at him for a long moment, something unreadable passing across his weathered face. Then, unexpectedly, he laughed, a short, rough sound that held no real humor. You remind me of me at that age, stubborn as hell and too tough for your own good. He started walking again. We'll cross that bridge when we come to it. For now, let's just focus on surviving winter. They made it back to the ranch house to find Rose exactly where they'd left her, sleeping peacefully with her tiny fist curled against her cheek. Elias checked her anyway, confirming she was breathing, confirming she was warm, confirming the world hadn't fallen apart in his absence. Caleb watched this ritual without comment, then went to prepare lunch like nothing significant had happened. But something had happened. Elias couldn't define it exactly, but the atmosphere in the house felt different now, less like a temporary shelter and more like something that might have permanence if they let it. March arrived with unseasonably warm weather that began melting the accumulated snow. The roads cleared enough for Sheriff Porter to make his promised visit, riding up to the ranch on a muddy afternoon with an expression that suggested he'd rather be anywhere else. Caleb met him on the porch while Elias watched nervously from the window, holding Rose. Come to check on us? Caleb asked. That's part of it. Porter dismounted and tied his horse to the post. Also need to inform you that I've made inquiries back east about the Reed family. Sent telegrams to Independence, Kansas City, a few other places. Elias's heart started pounding. This was it, the moment that would decide everything. And? Caleb's voice was carefully neutral. Found some distant relatives, second cousins on the mother's side, living in St. Louis. They've been notified about the children's situation. Are they willing to take them both? Porter's expression answered before his words did. They're willing to take the girl. She's young enough to be raised as one of their own, but the boy, he shook his head. They're not equipped for a child his age, especially one who's been through trauma. They suggested he'd be better served by an institution that specializes in difficult cases. The words hit like physical blows. An institution. They were calling Elias difficult, broken, damaged goods not worth the trouble. Caleb's jaw tightened. When are they expecting the children? I told them we'd arrange transport once the weather's fully clear, probably another few weeks. I see. Porter studied Caleb's face. You knew this would happen, Mercer. We talked about it being temporary. These kids need proper family. Those people aren't family. They're strangers who share some blood and are willing to take the easy child while dumping the hard one in an asylum. That's not fair. Fair? Caleb's voice rose. You want to talk about fair? That boy survived what would have killed grown men. He kept his baby sister alive for 3 days in the worst storm this territory has seen. He's smart, tough, and more capable than most adults I know. And you want to send him to an institution because some strangers find him inconvenient? Porter's expression hardened. What I want doesn't matter. The law is clear on this. Then the law can go to hell. Silence fell like a hammer. Both men stared at each other, tension radiating between them. Finally, Porter spoke quietly. Be very careful what you're saying, Mercer. You start talking about keeping children that aren't legally yours. You're opening a door to serious trouble. Maybe I'm tired of doing what's legal when what's legal is wrong. Inside the house, Elias listened with his heart hammering so hard he thought it might break through his chest. Caleb was fighting for them. Actually fighting, risking trouble with the law, risking everything for two children he'd claimed not to care about. Porter sighed heavily. I'll give you until the roads are fully clear. Use that time to say your goodbyes and prepare the children for what's coming. But this isn't negotiable, Mercer. When I come back, those kids are leaving with me. He mounted his horse and rode away, leaving Caleb standing alone on the porch, staring out at the melting snow. After several long minutes, Caleb turned and came back inside. He found Elias still standing by the window, Rose clutched tight against his chest. You heard? Caleb asked. Elias nodded. Then you know what's coming. I'm not going. Elias's voice shook but didn't break. I don't care what the law says. I'm not letting them take Rose to strangers and send me to some asylum. You don't have a choice. Yes, I do. I can run. Take Rose and disappear. They'll never find us. Caleb crossed the room in 3 long strides and knelt down so he was eye level with Elias. His face was harder than the boy had ever seen it. Listen to me very carefully. You run and you'll die. Both of you. You're 6 years old with no money, no supplies, and no idea how to survive on your own. The frontier will eat you alive, and Rose will be the first to go. Is that what you want? I want us to stay together. I know, but wanting something doesn't make it possible. You could make it possible. The words came out before Elias could stop them. You could keep us. Tell the sheriff we're staying. Caleb's expression flickered. Surprise, pain, something that might have been longing quickly suppressed. It's not that simple. Why not? Because I'm not equipped to raise children. Because I failed my own family once, and I won't do that again. Because you deserve better than a broken-down rancher who doesn't know the first thing about being a father. I don't care about any of that. You kept us alive. You taught me things. Elias's voice cracked. You're the only person left who knows what Rose and I went through. If you send us away, nobody will remember. Nobody will know what she survived or what I did to protect her. It'll be like it never mattered. For a long moment, Caleb said nothing. He just knelt there with his hands on his knees, his weathered face working through emotions he clearly didn't know how to process. Then Rose made a soft cooing sound, and Caleb's eyes moved to her tiny face peeking out from the blankets. Something in his expression crumbled. I can't promise you anything, he said finally, his voice rough. But I'll talk to the sheriff again. See if there's any legal way to challenge this. No guarantees, understand? The law probably won't bend, but I'll try. It wasn't enough. It wasn't nearly enough. But it was more than Elias had expected, and right now that tiny sliver of hope was all he had to hold on to. Thank you, he whispered. Caleb stood abruptly, like the emotion in the room had become too much to bear. Don't thank me yet. This probably won't work. He grabbed his coat and headed for the door, then paused with his hand on the handle. If it comes down to them taking you anyway, he said, without turning around, I need you to promise me something. Promise me you'll go with Porter peacefully. Don't fight, don't run, don't make this harder than it has to be. Can you do that? Elias wanted to refuse, wanted to scream that he'd never go peacefully, that they'd have to drag him away kicking and screaming. But Caleb had asked for a promise, and promises meant something. I promise, Elias said, the words tasting like ash. Caleb nodded once and left, the door closing behind him with terrible finality. Elias stood alone in the ranch house with Rose in his arms, listening to Caleb's horse gallop away toward town, and tried very hard not to imagine what came next. The days that followed Caleb's departure felt like waiting for an execution. Elias went through the motions of daily life, feeding Rose, tending the fire, doing his chores, but everything felt hollow and temporary. He kept catching himself memorizing details of the ranch house, storing away memories like a man preparing for exile. Caleb returned 3 days later, looking worse than Elias had ever seen him. His face was haggard, his eyes red-rimmed from lack of sleep. He dismounted slowly, moving like every muscle hurt, and stood in the yard for a long moment before finally approaching the house. Elias met him at the door, unable to read the expression on the rancher's weathered face. Well? The word came out barely above a whisper. Caleb walked past him into the house and collapsed into his chair by the fireplace. He sat there staring at nothing for what felt like an eternity before finally speaking. I talked to everyone. Sheriff Porter, the town council, even the territorial judge who was passing through Abilene on circuit. Asked about adoption laws, guardianship, any legal avenue that might let you stay. He rubbed his face with both hands. They all said the same thing. I'm a single man with no blood relation to either of you. The children's relatives have a legal claim. There's no precedent for what I'm asking. Elias felt something cold and heavy settle in his chest. So that's it. We're leaving. I didn't say that. Caleb looked up, and for the first time Elias saw something in his eyes that might have been defiance. I said there's no legal precedent, but Judge Morrison, he's an old bastard who doesn't like being told what he can and can't do. He gave me something to work with. What? A hearing. He's agreed to hold a formal hearing in 2 weeks to determine what's in the children's best interests. He'll listen to arguments from both sides, the relatives who want Rose and the orphanage, and me if I'm willing to make a case for keeping you both. Hope flared in Elias's chest, painful and desperate. You're going to fight for us? Caleb's expression was complicated, part determination, part fear, part something that looked almost like resignation. I'm going to try. But you need to understand something, Elias. This isn't guaranteed. The odds are stacked against us. Those relatives have the law on their side, and I've got nothing but my word that I can provide a stable home for 2 children I barely know. You know us better than they do. That won't matter to the judge if I can't prove I'm capable of raising you properly. Caleb leaned forward, his elbows on his knees. They're going to question everything. My past, my lifestyle, why a solitary rancher suddenly wants to keep 2 orphans. They'll dig into things I'd rather leave buried. What things? Caleb was quiet for several seconds. Then, after my family died, I didn't handle it well. Spent about 2 years drunk more often than sober. Got into fights. Nearly lost the ranch because I stopped caring about anything. Eventually pulled myself together, but that history's still there. They'll use it against me. That was 8 years ago. Doesn't matter. They'll say a man who fell apart once might do it again, and children shouldn't be risked on that. Elias processed this information, trying to understand what it meant. Are you going to fall apart again? The directness of the question seemed to catch Caleb off guard. He studied Elias's face for a long moment before answering. I don't know. I thought I'd learned to live with the loss, built walls high enough that nothing could touch me anymore. Then I found you 2 in that storm, and those walls started cracking whether I wanted them to or not. Is that bad? I don't know that either. Caleb stood and moved to check on Rose sleeping in her basket. He looked down at her tiny sleeping form with an expression that was equal parts tenderness and terror. What I do know is that I can't send you to an asylum and her to strangers. I can't do that and still live with myself. So I'm going to stand in front of that judge and make the best case I can. If it works, you stay. If it doesn't, he trailed off, unable or unwilling to finish the sentence. If it doesn't, then at least you tried. Elias's voice was steadier than he felt. That's more than anyone else has done for us. Caleb's jaw tightened. He turned away from the basket and headed toward the door. I need to prepare. Figure out what to say, how to say it. The hearing's in 2 weeks. Not much time. What should I do? Take care of your sister. Stay out of trouble. And maybe... Caleb paused with his hand on the door handle. Maybe start thinking about what you'd want to say to the judge if he asks you. They might want to hear from you directly. The thought of speaking in front of a judge, in front of a room full of adults deciding his fate, made Elias's stomach knot with anxiety. But if it meant a chance to stay with Rose and Caleb, he'd do it. I can do that. Caleb nodded once and left, heading toward the barn where he spent the rest of the afternoon working on ranch repairs with an intensity that suggested he was trying to exhaust himself beyond the ability to think. The next 2 weeks passed in a strange, suspended tension. Caleb worked from dawn until well past dark, repairing fences, mending the barn roof, organizing supplies with an almost manic energy. He barely slept, barely ate, and spoke only when necessary. Elias recognized the behavior for what it was, a man trying to outrun his own thoughts and failing. He tried to help where he could, taking over more of Rose's care, handling household chores without being asked, staying quiet and unobtrusive. Some instinct told him that Caleb needed space to work through whatever internal battle he was fighting. But at night, when Rose was asleep and the house was quiet, Elias would sometimes hear Caleb pacing in his room upstairs, back and forth, like a caged animal looking for an exit that didn't exist. 5 days before the hearing, a stranger arrived at the ranch. Elias saw her coming from the window, a woman on horseback, riding side saddle with practiced ease. She was maybe 35, dressed in practical travel clothes that suggested she'd made a long journey. Her face was pleasant but stern, framed by dark hair pulled back in a tight bun. Caleb emerged from the barn as she dismounted. Elias couldn't hear their conversation from inside, but he saw Caleb's body language shift from defensive to resigned. After several minutes of discussion, Caleb gestured toward the house, and they both approached. The woman entered first, her sharp eyes immediately finding Elias standing protectively near Rose's basket. She studied him with an assessing gaze that made him uncomfortable. "Elias," Caleb said, his tone neutral. "This is Mrs. Catherine Brennan. She's been sent by the Territorial Child Welfare Board to evaluate the living situation here before the hearing." Mrs. Brennan offered a tight smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Hello, Elias. I'm here to make sure you and your sister are being properly cared for. I'll be asking you some questions, looking around the house, and spending some time observing. Is that all right?" It wasn't really a question. Elias nodded mutely. What followed was the most uncomfortable afternoon of his life. Mrs. Brennan inspected every corner of the ranch house, making notes in a small leather journal. She checked the pantry, examined Rose's sleeping arrangements, tested the temperature near the fireplace, and asked questions that felt designed to trap him. "Does Mr. Mercer ever lose his temper with you?" "No, ma'am." "Does he drink spirits?" "I've never seen him drink anything but coffee and water." "Do you feel safe here?" "Yes, ma'am." "Are you sure? You can tell me the truth, Elias. If something's wrong, I can help." "Nothing's wrong." She didn't look convinced. She watched him carefully as he fed Rose, noted how he checked her temperature and adjusted her blankets. She observed Caleb interacting with both children during dinner, the stilted conversation, the careful distance he maintained, the obvious discomfort with physical affection. After the meal, she asked to speak with Caleb privately outside. They stood on the porch for nearly an hour, their voices low but occasionally rising in what sounded like argument. Elias couldn't make out the words, but he could read Caleb's increasingly tense posture. When Mrs. Brennan finally left, she gave Elias a long look that might have been pity before mounting her horse and riding away into the gathering dusk. Caleb came back inside looking like he'd aged 10 years. He sat heavily in his chair and stared at the fire without speaking. "What did she say?" Elias finally asked. "That the house is adequate. The children appear healthy and cared for, but..." Caleb's voice was flat. "She has concerns about my capability to provide emotional support and proper guidance. She noted the lack of warmth in my interactions with you both. Said children need more than just food and shelter." "That's not fair. You've been good to us. I've kept you alive." "That's not the same as being good." Caleb rubbed his face tiredly. "She's going to recommend to the judge that Rose be placed with the relatives in St. Louis and you be sent to a boys' home in Kansas City that specializes in children who've experienced trauma." The words hung in the air like a death sentence. "So we already lost," Elias said quietly. "Her recommendation isn't binding. The judge will make the final decision." But Caleb's tone suggested he didn't believe it would make a difference. They sat in silence for a long time, the only sound the crackling fire and Rose's soft breathing from her basket. Finally, Caleb spoke again. "I wasn't ready for this. When I found you in that storm, I thought I'd just get you somewhere safe and hand you off to people who knew what they were doing. Didn't plan on..." He gestured vaguely. "This, caring whether you stayed or went, lying awake at night worrying about what happens to you." "You don't have to care," Elias said. "You don't owe us anything." "That's what I keep telling myself. Doesn't seem to matter." Caleb looked at him directly. "Truth is, having you here has been, I don't know, like something frozen started thawing, and I'm not sure if that's good or if it just means more pain when it all falls apart." Elias understood that feeling better than he could articulate. Letting yourself hope, letting yourself believe things might work out, it made the eventual disappointment that much worse. "What do we do?" he asked. "We go to that hearing, we tell the truth, and we see what happens." Caleb stood and headed toward the stairs, then paused. "Get some sleep. You're going to need your strength for what's coming." The day of the hearing arrived cold and gray, with thick clouds promising snow that hadn't yet fallen. Caleb hitched the wagon, and they made the 6-mile journey to Abilene in tense silence, Rose bundled in blankets between them. The town was bigger than Elias had imagined, maybe 300 people, with a main street lined with storefronts, a hotel, a saloon, and the territorial courthouse where their fate would be decided. People stopped to stare as the wagon passed, and Elias heard whispers about the Blizzard Boy and Mercer's orphans. The courthouse was a sturdy brick building that looked imposing and official. Inside, a clerk directed them to a hearing room on the second floor where Judge Morrison would preside. The room was smaller than Elias expected, with wooden benches for observers and a raised platform where the judge would sit. Already present were Sheriff Porter, Mrs. Brennan with her leather journal, and a well-dressed couple Elias assumed were the relatives from St. Louis. The man was middle-aged and prosperous-looking, with a gold watch chain and expensive clothes. The woman was younger, maybe late 20s, with a soft face and kind eyes that kept drifting to Rose with obvious longing. They didn't look cruel. That somehow made it worse. A side door opened and Judge Morrison entered. A gray-haired man in his 60s with a face like weathered granite and eyes that missed nothing. Everyone stood as he took his seat behind the bench. "Be seated," he said, his voice carrying authority. "This is an informal hearing to determine the custody arrangements for the minor children Elias Reed, age 6, and Rose Reed, age approximately 7 months. I've reviewed the written statements from all parties. We're here today to hear testimony and make a decision in the children's best interests." He looked at the couple from St. Louis. "Mr. and Mrs. Hartwell, you're the children's second cousins on the maternal side, is that correct?" Mr. Hartwell stood. "Yes, Your Honor. My wife's mother and the children's grandmother were sisters." "And you're willing to provide a home for the infant Rose?" "We are, Your Honor. We have a comfortable home in St. Louis, financial stability, and no children of our own. We can give Rose every advantage: education, proper upbringing, a family." "What about the boy?" Mr. Hartwell's expression became uncomfortable. "We've given that considerable thought, Your Honor, but we're simply not equipped to handle a child of his age and particular circumstances. We understand he's been through significant trauma. We believe he would benefit more from an institution designed for such cases." "In other words, you want the baby, but not her brother." "We want what's best for both children. Sometimes that means recognizing our own limitations." Judge Morrison's face revealed nothing. He turned to Caleb. "Mr. Mercer, you're asking this court to grant you guardianship of both children despite having no blood relation and no prior experience raising a family. Make your case." Caleb stood slowly. For a moment he just stood there, looking uncomfortable and out of place in his clean but worn ranch clothes. Then he began speaking, his voice rough but steady. "I'm not going to pretend I'm the ideal guardian. I'm not married. I live alone. I spent years after my own family died drinking myself half to death. I'm not educated. I'm not refined. I'm just a rancher trying to keep a piece of land productive in country that doesn't forgive mistakes." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "But I found these children dying in a blizzard. Watched that boy stand guard over his baby sister with nothing but a stick, refusing to let her die even though he was half frozen himself. I've seen grown men with less courage than what that 6-year-old showed." Caleb's voice grew stronger. "I brought them to my ranch, kept them safe through an outlaw attack, taught the boy what I could. And somewhere in there, I stopped thinking of them as temporary problems and started thinking of them as mine, as people I'm responsible for." "Responsibility isn't the same as capability," Judge Morrison said. "Mrs. Brennan's report suggests you lack the emotional capacity to properly nurture these children. She's probably right." Caleb's blunt honesty seemed to surprise everyone. "I'm not good at the soft stuff. Don't know how to comfort or coddle. I teach through hard work and expect them to keep up. That's not ideal for children." "Then why should I grant you custody?" Caleb looked at Elias, and something in his expression shifted. "Because those children deserve someone who knows what they survived, who understands that they're tougher than they should have to be, and who won't treat them like they're broken just because they've been through hell." He turned back to the judge. "The Hartwells seem like good people, but they want to take Rose and send Elias to an asylum because he's inconvenient. That boy kept his sister alive through conditions that would have killed most adults, and their response is to call him traumatized and difficult and in need of institutional care. He may well need specialized support. What he needs is his sister. What he needs is not to be punished for being strong enough to survive. What he needs is someone who won't separate them because it's easier than keeping them together. The passion in Caleb's voice was building now, breaking through the careful control he usually maintained. I'm not perfect. I'm probably going to make mistakes, but I can promise you this: I won't give up on them. I won't send one away because the other's easier to manage, and I won't let them forget what they're capable of. He sat down abruptly, like he'd used up all his words at once. Judge Morrison was quiet for a long moment. Then he looked at Elias. "Young man, do you have anything you'd like to say?" Elias's heart hammered. He stood on shaking legs, aware of every eye in the room focused on him. He'd practiced what to say 100 times, but now all those carefully rehearsed words disappeared. "I want to stay with Rose," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "And I want to stay with Caleb." "Why?" the judge asked gently. "Because—" Elias struggled to find words for feelings he barely understood himself. "Because when my parents died, I promised to protect Rose. Caleb's the only person who understands what that means. The only one who doesn't try to take that away from me. The Hartwells could provide your sister with advantages Mr. Mercer cannot. They could give her nice clothes and a fancy house, but they don't know what she survived. They don't know that she stopped breathing twice during that blizzard, and I brought her back. They don't know what it cost to keep her alive." Elias's voice was getting stronger, fueled by desperation. "If you send her with them, all of that disappears. Nobody will remember. Nobody will tell her the story when she's older. It'll be like it never happened, like Mama and Papa and everything we went through didn't matter. And you think Mr. Mercer will remember? I know he will, because he saved us when nobody else would have. He fought outlaws to protect us. He's fighting you now to keep us. That's more than anyone else has done." Judge Morrison studied Elias for a long moment, his weathered face unreadable. "You may sit." Elias sat, his legs nearly giving out beneath him. Caleb's hand briefly touched his shoulder, just for a second, just enough to communicate something that might have been pride or gratitude or both. The judge consulted his notes, spoke quietly with the clerk, and appeared to be considering something carefully. The silence stretched until it became almost unbearable. Finally, Judge Morrison looked up. "This is not an easy decision. The law favors blood relatives, and the Hartwell's offer provides clear advantages for the infant. However," he paused significantly, "the law also requires me to consider the best interests of both children, not just one." He looked at Mr. and Mrs. Hartwell. "Your offer to take Rose is generous, but your refusal to accept her brother suggests you view these children as separable. They are not. They are siblings who survived an ordeal together, and that bond has meaning." Mr. Hartwell started to object, but the judge held up his hand. "Mr. Mercer, your request raises concerns about your capability as a guardian. Mrs. Brennan's evaluation notes that you lack warmth and emotional availability, qualities children need. However," another pause, "she also notes that the children appear healthy, well cared for, and that the boy shows remarkable competence for his age. These things don't happen by accident." Judge Morrison leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful. "I'm going to do something unusual here. I'm granting Mr. Mercer provisional guardianship for both children, effective immediately." The room erupted. Mrs. Hartwell gasped. Mr. Hartwell stood and protested. Mrs. Brennan's pen scratched furiously in her journal. The judge's gavel cracked like a gunshot. "Order! I'm not finished!" Everyone fell silent. "This guardianship is provisional and conditional. Mr. Mercer, you will submit to regular evaluations by the Territorial Child Welfare Board. Mrs. Brennan will visit quarterly to assess the children's well-being. If at any point I receive reports of neglect, abuse, or inadequate care, this guardianship will be revoked immediately, and the children placed elsewhere. Is that clear?" "Yes, Your Honor," Caleb said, his voice rough with emotion he was barely containing. "Furthermore, when the girl reaches school age, you will ensure she receives proper education, the boy as well. I won't have these children growing up ignorant because you think ranch work is sufficient preparation for life." "Understood." Finally, Judge Morrison looked directly at Elias. "Young man, you've been given a voice in your own future, which is rare at your age. If at any time you feel unsafe or wish to revisit this arrangement, you are to notify Sheriff Porter immediately. Your well-being matters more than any adult's pride. Clear?" Elias nodded. unable to speak around the lump in his throat. Then this hearing is concluded. The children will remain with Mr. Mercer under the conditions I've outlined. The judge's gavel came down with finality. For several seconds, nobody moved. Then Caleb stood, his movement slightly unsteady, and turned to Elias. They stared at each other, both apparently unable to process what had just happened. "We won," Elias whispered. Elias ansas. "Provisionally," Caleb corrected, but a smile was trying to break through his usual stern expression. "Don't start celebrating yet." But Elias was already moving, scooping Rose up from her basket and holding her close, tears streaming down his face that he didn't bother wiping away. They were staying together. All three of them. Against every odd, despite everything stacked against them, they were staying together. Outside the courthouse, Caleb helped them into the wagon, while a small crowd watched with mixed expressions, some approving, some skeptical, some openly disapproving. Elias didn't care. Let them think what they wanted. As they drove out of Abilene toward the ranch, snow began falling, light and gentle, nothing like the killer storm that had brought them together. Rose slept peacefully between them. Caleb drove with his usual competent silence, and Elias felt something unfamiliar unfurling in his chest. It took him a while to recognize what it was. Hope. Fragile and terrifying, but real. The ranch appeared in the distance, its simple buildings looking more like home than Elias had ever let himself believe they could be. Smoke rose from the chimney. Caleb had left a fire banked that morning. The fences they'd repaired together stood straight and sturdy. The barn where Elias had hidden from outlaws sat solid against the gray sky. It wasn't much, just a struggling ranch on the Kansas frontier run by a broken rancher trying to raise two children he barely knew how to care for. But it was theirs now, provisionally, conditionally, for however long they could make it work. And that would have to be enough. The first months after the hearing were harder than any of them expected. Winning the right to stay together turned out to be just the beginning. The real work was figuring out how three damaged people could build something resembling a family from the wreckage of their individual losses. Caleb threw himself into ranch work with renewed intensity, teaching Elias everything he knew about cattle, horses, crops, and frontier survival. But he still maintained that careful emotional distance, like he was afraid that getting too close would somehow curse them all. He provided, protected, and instructed, but he rarely touched, never hugged, and avoided conversations that went deeper than surface practicalities. Elias tried not to take it personally. He understood on some level that Caleb was doing the best he could with tools that had been broken 8 years ago when his first family died. But understanding didn't make it hurt less when he woke screaming from nightmares, and Caleb just called out from his room asking if he was all right instead of coming to check. Rose, mercifully, was too young to understand any of this. She grew steadily stronger through the spring, her weak cries becoming lusty demands for attention. By the time the snow fully melted, she was sitting up on her own and had started making sounds that might eventually become words. Mrs. Brennan arrived for her first quarterly evaluation in late April, riding up to the ranch with her leather journal and that same assessing expression. She spent 2 full days inspecting everything, asking questions, watching how they interacted. Elias could tell she was looking for reasons to recommend they be removed. Every time he slipped up, spilled milk at breakfast, forgot to sweep the porch, spoke too sharply when he was tired, he saw her make a note in that journal. It made him feel like a prisoner being watched for escape attempts. On the second evening, after Rose was asleep, Mrs. Brennan sat with Caleb at the kitchen table while Elias pretended to read by the fire, but actually listened to every word. "The children are physically healthy," Mrs. Brennan said. "The house is adequately maintained. I see no signs of abuse or neglect." "But," Caleb's tone suggested he'd been expecting this, "but I remain concerned about the emotional environment. You're still maintaining too much distance. The boy needs affection, reassurance, someone to help him process what he's been through. Instead, you're treating him like a ranch hand in training." "I'm teaching him to survive." "Survival isn't the same as living, Mr. Mercer. That boy has nightmares almost every night. Did you know that?" Caleb's silence answered the question. He wakes up terrified, checks on his sister obsessively, and eventually cries himself back to sleep. Alone. Because you stay in your room instead of comforting him. "I don't—" Caleb stopped, seeming to struggle with the words. "I don't know how to comfort him. Every time I try to think of what to say, I remember my daughter crying in the night while fever burned her alive, and how nothing I said or did made any difference. So I stay in my room because at least that way I'm not making empty promises." The raw honesty in his voice made Elias's throat tighten. He'd never heard Caleb talk about his dead family like that, with such naked pain barely controlled. Mrs. Brennan's expression softened slightly. "You're not the only parent who's ever felt helpless, Mr. Mercer, but that child needs you anyway. Imperfectly, inadequately, he still needs you. And if I fail him the way I failed my own daughter, then you fail. But at least you tried." After Mrs. Brennan left the next morning, Caleb was quieter than usual. He worked the ranch with mechanical efficiency, but his mind was clearly elsewhere. That night, when Elias woke screaming from a nightmare about his parents dying in the snow, he heard Caleb's bedroom door open. Footsteps came down the stairs, stopped outside Elias's room, waited there for what felt like an eternity. Then the door opened and Caleb stood there in the darkness, looking uncomfortable and uncertain. "You all right?" he asked. "Yeah." Elias wiped his face quickly. "Just a bad dream." Caleb shifted his weight, clearly fighting with himself about something. Finally, he crossed the room and sat on the edge of the bed, the first time he'd ever done that. "Your parents," Caleb said slowly. "In the dream, were they suffering?" The question caught Elias off guard. "Yeah." "And you couldn't help them?" "No." Caleb nodded like this confirmed something. "I dream about my daughter sometimes. She's burning with fever and crying for me to make it stop, and I can't do anything except watch her die. Been having that same dream for 8 years. Doesn't get better. You just learn to live with it." He stood to leave, then paused. "The nightmares don't mean you're weak. They mean you love them. That's not something to be ashamed of." It wasn't much. It wasn't the warm comfort a real father might have offered, but coming from Caleb, it meant everything. "Thank you," Elias whispered. Caleb left without responding, but after that night, whenever Elias woke from nightmares, he'd hear Caleb's door open. The rancher never came into the room again, but knowing he was listening, that he cared enough to check, that helped more than Elias could have explained. Small changes began accumulating like spring rain filling a drought-dried creek. Caleb started teaching Elias to read properly using old newspapers and his few books. They'd sit together after dinner, Caleb patiently sounding out words Elias struggled with, until gradually the letters stopped being random marks and started forming meaning. Elias taught Rose to laugh by making ridiculous faces until she'd shriek with delight. The sound was so unexpected, so purely joyful, that even Caleb would pause his work to listen. They established routines that felt almost normal. Breakfast at dawn, morning chores, lunch whenever they remembered, afternoon lessons, dinner together at the table instead of eating separately, evenings by the fire with Caleb reading aloud from newspapers while Elias played with Rose. It wasn't perfect. Caleb still struggled with emotional openness. Elias still woke screaming 2 or 3 times a week. Rose still had episodes where she'd cry inconsolably for reasons nobody could identify. But they were trying. All 3 of them, in their broken and inadequate ways, were trying. Summer arrived hot and dry, bringing with it new challenges. The creek that fed the ranch dropped to a trickle. The cattle grew restless and difficult. Caleb had to ride further each day to find adequate grazing, sometimes leaving before dawn and not returning until after dark. On those days, Elias was responsible for everything: Rose's care, the chickens, maintaining the house, keeping watch for trouble. It was exhausting and terrifying in equal measure. Every moment Caleb was gone, Elias imagined disasters. What if outlaws returned? What if Rose got sick? What if something happened to Caleb and they were left alone again? But each evening, Caleb would ride back into the yard, and Elias would feel that knot of anxiety in his chest loosen slightly. One particularly brutal afternoon in July, with temperatures over 100 degrees and no breeze to provide relief, Rose spiked another fever. Elias tried everything Caleb had taught him: cool water, willow bark tea, keeping her out of direct heat, but nothing worked. The fever climbed higher. By the time Caleb returned at sunset, Elias was nearly panicking. "She won't stop crying. The fever won't break. I don't know what else to do." Caleb took Rose and examined her quickly, his weathered face tight with concern. "She's burning up. We need to get her temperature down fast." They worked together through the night, taking turns holding her, administering medicine, praying silently to whatever might be listening that they wouldn't lose her. Caleb told stories to distract them both, tales about his cattle drives, about the time a tornado nearly destroyed the ranch, about his wife, who'd been tougher than any man he'd ever known. It was the most he'd ever talked about his past, and Elias understood it for what it was, a way of staying awake, staying focused, refusing to let fear take over. Dawn came with Rose's fever finally breaking. She slept peacefully in Caleb's arms while both he and Elias sat exhausted and hollow-eyed, too drained to feel relief yet. "I thought we were going to lose her," Elias whispered. "So did I." Caleb looked down at Rose's sleeping face. "That never gets easier. Watching someone you care about suffer and not being able to fix it makes you feel useless." "But we didn't lose her." "Not this time." Caleb's voice was rough with emotion. He wasn't quite hiding anymore. "But that's what scares me, Elias. Every time one of you gets sick or hurt, I'm right back there watching my daughter die, feeling that same helplessness. And I wonder if I'm strong enough to survive losing someone again." Elias looked at this man who'd saved them, fought for them, who was still so broken from losses that happened 8 years ago that he could barely let himself feel anything at all. "You don't have to be strong all the time," Elias said quietly. "That's not what makes you good at this." "Then what does?" "Showing up. Even when you're scared, even when you don't know what to do, you keep showing up anyway." Caleb was quiet for a long time, his calloused hand gently touching Rose's small head. "Your mother would be proud of you, the man you're becoming. I hope you know that." The words cracked something open in Elias's chest. He started crying, really crying for the first time since the hearing, letting out months of fear and grief and desperate hope he'd been holding back. And Caleb, awkward and uncertain but trying, pulled him close with his free arm and just held on while Elias fell apart. They stayed like that until full sunrise, 3 people who'd been broken by the frontier finding ways to hold each other together. The years that followed were never easy, but they got easier. Mrs. Brennan's evaluations became less hostile and more supportive. She still noted areas for improvement in her journal, but she also started writing things like genuine bond forming and children thriving despite unconventional situation. By the time Elias turned 8, he could handle most ranch work as competently as many adult hands. He could rope cattle, mend fences, read weather patterns, and shoot accurately enough to hunt small game. Caleb started paying him a small wage for his work. Not much, but enough to teach him the value of money and labor. Rose grew into a fierce and stubborn toddler who refused to accept that she was too small to do everything her brother did. She'd follow Elias around the ranch, demanding to help with chores she couldn't possibly manage yet. Her first clear word was Lias, her attempt at his name that stuck forever after. Caleb slowly, painfully, learned to show affection. It never came naturally to him, but he tried. Awkward hair ruffles, brief shoulder squeezes, gruff praise delivered while looking away. It wasn't much compared to what normal parents offered, but for 3 people learning to be family without a guidebook, it was enough. The frontier community of Abilene gradually accepted the strange household at Mercer Ranch. People stopped whispering when they came to town. Shopkeepers stopped treating them like curiosities. A few neighboring ranchers even started asking Caleb for advice about their own children, recognizing that somehow, against all odds, he'd figured something out. When Elias turned 10, Caleb took him on his first cattle drive, a 3-week journey to market in Dodge City. It was grueling work, dangerous at times, but Caleb treated him like a real member of the crew rather than a child along for education. Around the campfire one night, while the other drovers slept, Caleb spoke quietly. "I need to tell you something. About the adoption." Elias's heart jumped. "What about it?" "Judge Morrison passed away last month. The new territorial judge reviewed all of his provisional custody cases. Ours came up for evaluation." Fear washed through Elias. "Are they taking us away?" "The opposite." Caleb's weathered face showed something that might have been a smile. "The provisional period is over. The new judge made the guardianship permanent. You and Rose are legally mine now. No more evaluations, no more threat of removal. It's done." Elias couldn't speak. After 3 years of living under constant scrutiny, always aware that one mistake could cost them everything, it was over. They were safe. "I wanted to wait to tell you until we were alone," Caleb continued. Figured you'd want to hear it private-like before Rose and everyone else started making a fuss about it. Thank you. The words felt completely inadequate. For everything, for fighting for us, for not giving up even when it was hard. Caleb was quiet for several seconds. Then, you remember what you said to me that night Rose had the fever? About showing up being what matters? Elias nodded. You were right. I didn't know what I was doing. Still don't, most days. But I kept showing up, and somehow we made it work. He looked at Elias directly. You made it work. You and Rose gave me something to show up for. So if we're doing thank yous, then thank you too. They didn't say anything else, just sat together watching the stars wheel across the Kansas sky. Two people who'd found family in the aftermath of loss. The years continued rolling past like the endless prairie wind. Elias grew tall and capable, earning a reputation across the territory as one of the toughest young ranchers around. People started calling him the Blizzard Boy, partly because of the storm that had made him an orphan, partly because he had a talent for keeping his head during the worst weather when other men panicked. Rose grew into a sharp and compassionate young woman who refused to be limited by what the frontier said women could or couldn't do. She learned ranching right alongside her brother, but she also had a gift for bringing people together. The ranch house became known as a place where stranded travelers could find shelter, where widows could get help during hard times, where orphaned children might stay until proper arrangements could be made. It happened gradually, without anyone planning it, but Mercer Ranch transformed from a lonely property into something like a community gathering place. Caleb grumbled about the constant stream of visitors, but he never turned anyone away. When Elias was 18 and Rose was 12, another brutal winter storm hit the Kansas plains. Not as bad as the blizzard that had killed their parents, but bad enough that several families found themselves stranded on the road between towns. Elias and Caleb rode out into the storm to bring them in. 4 families total, including 3 young children. They spent 5 days packed into the ranch house while the storm raged, sharing food and warmth and stories. One evening, Elias watched Rose entertaining the children with made-up stories while their parents recovered from exposure. Caleb sat in his usual chair supervising, his weathered face showing something like contentment. You did good, Caleb said quietly. Building this. Making it mean something. We did it together. Maybe. But it was your heart that made it happen. You and Rose both. Caleb paused. I ever tell you what my wife said right before she died? Elias shook his head. She made me promise I wouldn't let grief kill me. Said I had too much life left to waste it being angry at fate. Caleb's voice was rough with old pain that had finally healed into scar tissue. Took me 8 years and 2 stubborn children to figure out what she meant. That life isn't about protecting yourself from loss. It's about loving anyway, even when you know it might destroy you. That's terrifying. Yeah, but it's also the only thing that makes any of this worth doing. Caleb looked at him directly. I failed my first family by not being able to save them, but I think I honored them by not failing you and Rose, by learning to love again even though it scared the hell out of me. Elias understood then what had taken all of them years to figure out. Family wasn't about blood or law or perfect emotional availability. It was about choosing to show up day after day, even when you were broken, even when you didn't know what you were doing, even when every instinct screamed at you to protect yourself instead. That winter storm passed like all storms eventually do, and the stranded families moved on to their destinations. But word spread about the ranch that had sheltered them, about the man who'd taken in orphans and somehow built something bigger than just survival. More people started stopping by during hard times. More children found temporary refuge there. And Caleb, who'd spent 8 years avoiding human connection, found himself at the center of an accidental community that needed exactly what he could offer: safety without judgment, help without conditions, second chances for people who'd been knocked down by life. The final winter came when Caleb was 67 and Elias was 24. Another blizzard, they seemed to mark every major transition in their lives, trapped them all inside for 3 days. Caleb had been declining for months, refusing to admit it, but unable to hide the way he moved slower, tired faster, breathed harder after minimal exertion. On the second night of the storm, his breathing became labored. By morning, he couldn't get out of bed. Elias and Rose took turns sitting with him, keeping him comfortable, pretending they didn't know what was coming. The storm made getting a doctor impossible, and honestly, they all knew it wouldn't matter anyway. Caleb was dying. Slowly, but inevitably, the same way he'd lived, on his own terms, without making a fuss about it. On the third evening, with the storm finally breaking outside and stars appearing through gaps in the clouds, Caleb waved Elias closer. "Need to tell you something," he rasped. "Been meaning to say it for years, but never knew how. Don't talk. Save your strength." "For what? I'm dying, boy. Let me use my last words on something that matters." Caleb's hand found Elias's and gripped it with surprising strength. "That day I found you in the storm, standing guard over your sister with nothing but a stick. I thought I was saving you." "You did save us." "No." "Listen." Caleb's breathing was getting harder. "You saved me. You and Rose both. You gave me a reason to be human again, to care about something other than just surviving. I was already dead when I found you, just too stubborn to lie down. You made me want to live again." Elias felt tears streaming down his face. "You're the best father I could have asked for. You know that, right? Even with all the rough edges and the emotional distance and the way you could barely hug us without looking uncomfortable. You were exactly what we needed." Caleb's laugh turned into a cough. When he recovered, his eyes were bright with moisture. "Figured I'd fail you the way I failed my first family. Spent years waiting for the disaster. But you two just kept growing up strong and good, despite me screwing everything up. Miracle, really." "You didn't screw anything up." "I did. But you forgave me for it anyway. That's what family does." Rose came into the room then, her eyes red from crying. She sat on the other side of the bed and took Caleb's free hand. "Don't leave us," she whispered. "Please, don't leave us." "Not my choice, sweetheart. But you'll be all right. You've got your brother, and this ranch, and each other. That's more than most people get." They sat with him through the night, taking turns telling stories about their years together. The good memories and the hard ones. The times they'd failed each other and the times they'd somehow gotten it right. Rose talked about the lessons he'd taught her. Elias reminded him of the first time he'd awkwardly tried to hug them both and nearly knocked them over because he'd forgotten how. Caleb laughed at that, a weak but genuine sound. "Never did figure out the soft stuff. You figured out enough," Elias said. Dawn was breaking when Caleb's breathing changed. He looked at both of them with eyes that were already seen somewhere else. "Proud of you," he managed. "Both of you. Tell the story right. Make sure people know what we built here, what we survived together." His eyes closed. His breathing slowed. And as the sun rose over the Kansas plains, bathing the ranch in pale winter light, Caleb Mercer died peacefully, surrounded by the family he'd accidentally created from 3 broken people and a promise to show up. The funeral drew nearly 100 people despite the winter cold. Ranchers, townsfolk, families who'd found shelter at the ranch over the years, children who'd been temporarily orphaned and remembered the gruff man who'd given them a place to stay. Sheriff Porter, now retired but still respected, gave the eulogy. He talked about Caleb's transformation from a broken recluse to a pillar of the community, about how he'd taken in 2 orphaned children against everyone's advice and somehow made it work through sheer, stubborn determination. But the story everyone remembered was the one Elias told afterward. He stood beside Caleb's grave with Rose at his side, looking out at the gathered crowd, and told them about a 6-year-old boy standing in a blizzard with a stick, refusing to let his baby sister die. About a hardened rancher who stopped for children he had every reason to leave behind. About 3 damaged people learning to be family without any instructions. "He saved our lives," Elias said, his voice carrying across the frozen cemetery. "But more than that, he taught us that survival isn't enough. That being tough doesn't mean being closed off. That you can be broken and still build something worth having." He looked down at the grave where they'd buried Caleb beside his first wife and daughter. He used to say he wasn't good at the soft stuff, but he was wrong. He was good at the stuff that mattered, showing up, standing firm, refusing to quit on people even when it would have been easier. Rose stepped forward and placed something on the grave, the crooked stick Elias had used to defend her in that long-ago storm. They'd kept it all these years, a reminder of where they'd come from. "This is where it started," Rose said softly, "with a promise to protect each other. That promise became a family. And that family became something bigger, a place where broken people could heal and lost people could find home." She looked at her brother, then out at the crowd. Caleb Mercer never wanted to be a hero. He just wanted to do right by 2 kids who needed him. But in doing that, he showed all of us what family really means. Not perfection, not ease, just showing up day after day, even when you're scared and broken and don't know what you're doing. The crowd was silent. Several people were crying. Even the bitter wind seemed to quiet for a moment, as if the frontier itself was paying respect. Elias and Rose stayed at the grave after everyone else left, standing together in the fading afternoon light. "What do we do now?" Rose asked. "What we've always done. Keep showing up. Run the ranch the way he taught us. Keep the door open for people who need shelter." Elias put his arm around his sister's shoulders. "Keep his memory alive by living the way he taught us to live." Rose leaned against him, and they stood there together until the sun touched the horizon and the temperature started dropping toward the brutal cold of full night. Then they walked back to the ranch house together, two survivors who'd become thrivers, carrying forward a legacy built on courage and stubbornness and the revolutionary act of refusing to quit on each other. The years that followed proved they'd learned their lessons well. Elias married a school teacher from Abilene and brought her to the ranch where she started a small school for children from outlying homesteads. Rose eventually married a neighboring rancher's son, but she never moved away, just expanded the operation across both properties. Together, they transformed Mercer Ranch into something that would have made Caleb simultaneously proud and deeply uncomfortable. It remained a working cattle ranch, but it was also a refuge, a school, a community center, and a testament to what broken people could build when they refused to stay broken. The story of the Blizzard Boy and his baby sister became local legend, told and retold until it took on mythic proportions. Most versions were exaggerated. Elias fighting off a dozen outlaws single-handed, Rose surviving 2 weeks in the storm instead of 3 days, Caleb performing impossible heroics. But the heart of the story remained true. 3 people who should have died found each other instead. 3 people who had every reason to stay closed off learned to be family. 3 people who'd lost everything discovered that starting over was possible if you were willing to show up for it. On winter evenings, when storms rattled the windows and snow piled deep around the ranch, Elias would tell his own children the real story. Not the legend, but the truth, with all its fear and failure and imperfect love. He'd tell them about standing in that blizzard with nothing but a crooked stick, about the rancher who stopped when he could have kept riding, about 3 broken people learning to be whole again through sheer stubborn refusal to give up. And he'd tell them the most important lesson Caleb had taught him, the one that had taken years to understand. Family isn't something you're born with. It's something you build from whatever materials you have available, blood or choice or pure accident. It doesn't have to be perfect. It doesn't even have to be easy. It just has to be real and worth fighting for, and strong enough to weather whatever storms the frontier throws at you. That's what they'd built at Mercer Ranch. That's what survived long after all 3 of them were gone. Not perfection or ease, but something better, proof that broken people could heal each other if they just kept showing up. And somewhere in the winter wind that swept eternally across the Kansas plains, you could almost hear Caleb's rough voice approving of what they'd made from the wreckage. Almost.